The judge's gavel strikes as 58-year-old Franklin White sits in handcuffs, facing 5 years in prison for helping a stranded Marine on a rural Indiana highway. But what this packed Highland Park County courthouse doesn't know is that in exactly 14 minutes, a military helicopter will land outside carrying General Tucker with classified Pentagon documents, proving Franklin isn't just an innocent mechanic wrongfully convicted by lies and prejudice, but one of the most decorated heroes in American military history, whose courage under enemy fire in Afghanistan saved 43 soldiers' lives in a mission so classified it was buried for 15 years. The witness who claimed Franklin threatened him has been lying to support a lawsuit against the county. The prosecutor built her career-advancing case on fabricated testimony, and the community that condemned this humble garage owner based on skin color and assumptions is about to learn they destroyed a genuine war hero who earned the Silver Star for extraordinary valor. But will the general arrive in time to save Franklin from a prison sentence that could kill him? And how did a man who risked everything to protect his fellow soldiers end up convicted of terrorizing the very people he once bled to defend? Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. 3 months earlier, the morning sun cast long shadows across Industrial Boulevard in Highland Park, Indiana, as Franklin White unlocked the metal doors of his small auto repair shop. The weathered sign above the entrance read, "White's Automotive, honest work, fair prices," in faded blue letters that Franklin had painted himself 15 years ago when he first opened the business. The building, a converted warehouse with oil-stained concrete floors and fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, had become Franklin's second home after his divorce 5 years earlier. Franklin moved with the careful precision of a man whose body carried old injuries, but whose spirit remained unbroken. At 58, his 6-foot frame still showed the military bearing that had defined him during his army years, though most people in Highland Park knew nothing about his service record. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his work clothes, though worn, were always clean and pressed. The deep scar running along his left forearm, a souvenir from an IED explosion in Afghanistan, was usually hidden beneath his long-sleeved work shirts. The first customer of the day arrived before Franklin had finished his morning coffee. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, a 74-year-old widow who had been bringing her ancient Buick to Franklin for over a decade, pulled into the shop's small parking lot with her car making the distinctive grinding noise that meant her brake pads needed replacing again. "Morning, Mrs. Jackson," Franklin called out, wiping his hands on a clean rag as he approached her car. "Sounds like those brakes are talking to you again." "Oh, Franklin, I swear this old car is trying to kill me," Mrs. Jackson replied, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age. "I was coming down Miller Street yesterday, and it took forever to stop at the intersection. Nearly scared me to death." Franklin opened the driver's door and helped Mrs. Jackson out of the car, his movements gentle and respectful. This was the kind of interaction that defined his reputation in Highland Park. Not flashy or dramatic, just consistent kindness and competence that had earned him a loyal customer base among the town's elderly and working-class residents. "Let me take a look under the hood first, then we'll get her up on the lift," Franklin said, already moving toward the front of the Buick. "I suspect it's more than just the pads this time. That grinding sound tells me the rotors might need attention, too." As Franklin examined Mrs. Jackson's car, his movements showed the methodical approach that had served him well during his military career. He checked each component systematically, explaining what he found in terms that Mrs. Jackson could understand without talking down to her. This attention to detail and respect for his customers had kept White's Automotive afloat, even as chain repair shops moved into Highland Park, offering lower prices but impersonal service. "How much is this going to cost me, Franklin?" Mrs. Jackson asked, worry creeping into her voice. My social security check doesn't stretch as far as it used to. Franklin paused in his examination, considering the woman who had trusted him with her car for over 10 years. Mrs. Jackson lived alone on a fixed income, and Franklin knew that unexpected repair bills could mean choosing between car maintenance and groceries. Tell you what, Mrs. Jackson, Franklin said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. I've got some rotors in the back that came off a trade-in last month. They're not brand new, but they've got plenty of life left. We'll use those and just charge you for the labor and pads. Should keep the total under $200. Relief flooded Mrs. Jackson's face as she reached into her purse for her checkbook. Franklin White, you are a blessing. I don't know what this town would do without you. This exchange, repeated dozens of times each month with different customers, represented Franklin's approach to business and life. He could have charged Mrs. Jackson full price for new rotors and made an extra $100, but his definition of success wasn't measured solely in profit margins. The military had taught him that taking care of people was more important than taking advantage of them. By noon, Franklin had completed Mrs. Jackson's brake job and was working on the transmission of a pickup truck belonging to Danny Martinez, a young construction worker whose wife had recently given birth to their second child. The truck's transmission was slipping badly, and a complete rebuild would cost more than Danny made in 2 months. I hate to ask this, Franklin, Danny said, his voice heavy with embarrassment. But is there any way you could let me pay this off over a few months? I know it's not how you usually do business, but with the new baby and all. Franklin looked up from under the hood of the truck, studying the young man's face. Danny had been a customer for 3 years, always paying his bills on time and never asking for special treatment. The desperation in his voice was real, and Franklin remembered what it felt like to be a young father worried about providing for his family. We can work something out, Franklin said simply. Let's focus on getting your truck running reliably first. We'll figure out the payment later. This willingness to work with customers who were struggling had earned Franklin a reputation as one of the most trusted businessmen in Highland Park. But it had also kept his own finances precariously balanced. The shop's bank account never held more than a few $1,000s, and Franklin's personal savings were minimal. He lived in a small apartment above a diner downtown, drove a 15-year-old Ford pickup, and spent his evenings reading military history books borrowed from the Highland Park Public Library. The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine, repairs and maintenance work. Franklin changed oil, replaced spark plugs, and diagnosed a mysterious rattling noise in an elderly teacher's Honda that turned out to be a loose heat shield. Each job was completed with the same careful attention to detail, and each customer received the same respectful treatment, regardless of their ability to pay full price immediately. Around 4 o'clock, as Franklin was cleaning his tools and preparing to close the shop, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed his daughter Vanessa calling from Chicago, where she worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Hey, Dad. Vanessa's voice carried the warmth that always made Franklin smile. How was your day? Same as always, sweetheart, Franklin replied, settling into the battered office chair behind his desk. Fixed some cars, helped some people, kept the lights on for another day. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, Vanessa continued, her tone becoming more serious. About you maybe selling the shop and moving up here to Chicago. Michael and I found a nice apartment complex near the hospital, and the rent isn't too bad. Franklin gazed around his small office, taking in the framed photograph of Vanessa's college graduation, the military challenge coins displayed on a shelf, and the stack of unpaid invoices that represented customers who would eventually pay but needed time. This shop wasn't just his business, it was his purpose, his way of serving his community the same way he had once served his country. Vanessa, I appreciate the offer, I really do, Franklin said carefully. But Highland Park is my home. These people depend on me, and I'm not ready to walk away from that. I know, Dad, but you're not getting any younger, and that shop doesn't exactly make you rich, Vanessa replied, with the loving concern of a daughter who worried about her father's future. What happens when you can't do the physical work anymore? Before Franklin could answer, the sound of a motorcycle engine sputtering and dying outside caught his attention. Through the shop's front window, he could see a young man in military fatigues pushing a black Harley-Davidson into the parking lot. The bike was clearly having mechanical problems, and the rider looked frustrated and stranded. "Vanessa, I need to go," Franklin said, already standing up from his desk. "There's a soldier outside who needs help, and it looks like he's having a rough day." "Okay, Dad, but promise me you'll think about what I said." "I promise, sweetheart, love you." Franklin ended the call and walked outside to where the young Marine was examining his motorcycle with the expression of someone whose day had just taken a turn for the worse. The soldier looked to be in his mid-20s with the short haircut and bearing that marked him as recently returned from deployment. His desert camouflage uniform bore the name tape Stone and the rank insignia of a staff sergeant. "Afternoon," Franklin called out as he approached. "Looks like you're having some trouble there." Derek Stone looked up, relief evident in his eyes as he saw Franklin approaching. "Yes, sir. This bike just died on me about a mile down the road. I managed to push it this far, but I'm not sure what's wrong with it." "Well, let's take a look," Franklin said, his voice carrying the calm confidence that came from 30 years of solving mechanical problems. "I'm Franklin White. This is my shop. Staff Sergeant Derek Stone, sir. I really appreciate you taking a look. I'm supposed to be back at Camp Lejeune tomorrow, and this is my only transportation." Franklin knelt beside the motorcycle, his experienced hands already checking the obvious potential problems. The bike was well maintained, which told him that Derek took care of his equipment, a good sign in Franklin's experience. The problem wasn't immediately obvious, which meant it would require some diagnostic work. "When did it start acting up?" Franklin asked as he examined the fuel lines and electrical connections. "This morning, about 50 miles out of Indianapolis," Derek replied. "It started running rough, then the engine just cut out completely. I thought maybe it was bad gas, but I filled up at a major station." Franklin continued his examination, his movements efficient and purposeful. The motorcycle's engine was sophisticated, but the principles were the same as any internal combustion engine he had worked on. After a few minutes of checking various systems, he found what he was looking for. "Found your problem," Franklin announced, pointing to a small electrical component near the engine. "Your ignition control module is failing. That's why it was running rough before it died completely." Derek's shoulders sagged with disappointment. How much is something like that going to cost to fix? Franklin could hear the concern in the young Marine's voice and recognized the tone of someone whose military pay didn't leave much room for unexpected expenses. He had been in that exact situation many times during his own service years. "The part itself runs about $150, Franklin said thoughtfully, "but I might have a compatible module in my parts inventory. Let me check." As Franklin walked back into the shop to search his parts shelves, Derek followed, grateful for any help that might get him back on the road without breaking his budget. The shop's interior was organized chaos. Parts bins lined the walls, tools hung in precise arrangements, and the air smelled of motor oil and metal cleaner that reminded Derek of military motor pools. "You serve?" Derek asked, noticing the military challenge coins displayed on Franklin's desk. Franklin paused in his search through a bin of electrical components. "Army. Did 4 tours overseas before I got out and opened this place." "Thank you for your service, sir," Derek said automatically, but with genuine respect in his voice. "Thank you for yours," Franklin replied, pulling a small electronic component from a parts bin. "Looks like this is your lucky day. This module came off Bike that got totaled in an accident last year. Owner didn't want to rebuild it, so I bought the salvageable parts." Franklin held up the ignition control module, examining it carefully in the afternoon light streaming through the shop's windows. The part was used but in good condition, and it would definitely solve Derek's problem without requiring him to spend money he probably didn't have. "What do I owe you for this?" Derek asked, reaching for his wallet. Franklin considered the young Marine standing in his shop, far from home and trying to get back to his unit on time. He thought about his own early military years, when unexpected expenses could mean choosing between car repairs and meals. The business side of his brain calculated the cost of the part and the labor involved, but the human side remembered what it felt like to be young, broke, and responsible to the military for being where you were supposed to be when you were supposed to be there. "Tell you what," Franklin said, already moving toward his tool chest. "This part's been sitting on my shelf for over a year. I'll throw it in for free if you help me install it. Shouldn't take more than 30 minutes and you'll be back on the road." The gratitude in Derek's eyes was worth more to Franklin than the $50 he could have charged for the part. This was the kind of moment that made all the financial struggles of running a small business worthwhile, the opportunity to help someone who really needed it, especially a fellow veteran who was just trying to do his job. As Franklin began the process of replacing the faulty ignition control module, neither he nor Derek could have imagined that this simple act of kindness between two veterans would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy Franklin's reputation, threaten his freedom, and reveal secrets that had been buried in military files for over 15 years. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The late afternoon sun slanted through the shop's windows as Franklin worked, his experienced hands making quick work of the repair. Derek assisted by holding tools and following instructions, and their conversation revealed the easy camaraderie that often developed between veterans who recognized something familiar in each other. "Where did you serve?" Derek asked as Franklin tightened the last connection on the new ignition control module. "Afghanistan, mostly," Franklin replied, without elaborating. "Different time, different war than what you guys are dealing with now." Derek nodded, understanding that some military experiences weren't meant for casual conversation. He had his own memories that he preferred to keep private, and he respected Franklin's right to do the same. "Try starting her up now," Franklin said, stepping back from the motorcycle. Derek turned the ignition key, and the Harley's engine roared to life with a smooth, powerful sound that indicated the repair had been successful. The bike ran perfectly, with none of the rough idling or hesitation that had plagued it earlier. "Sir, I can't thank you enough," Derek said over the sound of the engine. "You saved my career today. If I'd missed movement tomorrow, I would have been in serious trouble with my command." Franklin waved off the thanks with the modest gesture of someone who considered helping others a normal part of life, rather than something deserving special recognition. "Just take care of yourself over there, son, and keep that bike maintained. It's a good machine if you treat it right." As Derek prepared to leave, he pulled a $20 bill from his wallet and tried to hand it to Franklin. "At least let me pay for your time, sir." Franklin shook his head firmly. "Keep your money. Use it to buy dinner somewhere between here and North Carolina." Derek pocketed the money reluctantly, knowing that arguing would be pointless, but feeling uncomfortable. "Accepting so much help without compensation. If there's ever anything I can do to repay this, sir, you just let me know." "Just pass it on," Franklin replied with a smile. "Help someone else when you get the chance." Derek climbed onto his motorcycle, revved the engine once more to confirm it was running properly, then rode out of Franklin's parking lot with a final wave of thanks. The sound of the Harley's engine faded into the distance as Derek headed south toward Camp Lejeune, leaving Franklin alone in his shop as the day wound toward evening. Franklin cleaned up his tools and locked the shop, unaware that his simple act of kindness had been observed by Tyler Bennett, a 22-year-old local man who had been walking past the shop on his way home from his job at a fast food restaurant. Tyler had watched through the shop's windows as Franklin worked on Derek's motorcycle, and he had seen the interaction between the two veterans with growing resentment. Tyler, whose own attempts to enlist in the military had been rejected due to a juvenile criminal record, harbored deep resentment toward both successful veterans and black business owners who seemed to receive more respect in the community than he felt he deserved. Watching Franklin help Derek for free triggered a combination of racial prejudice and class resentment that would soon poison everything Franklin had worked to build in Highland Park. As Franklin drove home to his small apartment that evening, he felt the quiet satisfaction that came from a day well spent. He had helped his regular customers with their automotive problems, kept his business running despite financial pressures, and assisted a fellow veteran who needed help getting home. It had been an ordinary day by Franklin's standards, marked by the kind of small kindnesses that he considered simply part of being a decent human being. He had no way of knowing that Tyler Bennett was already planning how to use what he had witnessed to his own advantage, or that the simple act of helping Derek Stone would soon be twisted into something criminal by people who saw Franklin's skin color and assumed the worst about his motives. The seeds of the nightmare that would soon engulf Franklin's life had already been planted, waiting for the right combination of prejudice, ambition, and opportunity to bloom into the kind of injustice that could destroy an innocent man's life. 2 weeks after Derek Stone's motorcycle breakdown, Tyler Bennett sat in the cramped office of Hartwell and Associates, a personal injury law firm located in a strip mall between a payday loan store and a discount liquor shop. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and cheap air freshener, while outdated magazines covered a scratched glass table. Tyler fidgeted with his baseball cap as he waited to meet with attorney Jason Hartwell, a man whose television commercials promised maximum compensation for accident victims. Tyler had spent those 2 weeks researching Highland Park County's liability laws and had discovered something that made his pulse quicken with opportunity. The county could be held financially responsible for accidents caused by dangerous road conditions, and Highway 67, where Derek's motorcycle had broken down, had been the site of multiple accidents over the past 3 years. If Tyler could prove that the road's poor maintenance had caused him psychological trauma from witnessing what he would claim was a threatening encounter, he might be looking at a settlement worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mr. Bennett, a receptionist with heavily applied makeup called his name, Mr. Hartwell will see you now. Jason Hartwell's office was designed to impress clients with its dark wood furniture and diplomas covering one wall, though a closer inspection would reveal that his law degree came from an unaccredited online university. Hartwell specialized in questionable liability claims and had built his practice on the principle that any incident could be transformed into a lawsuit with the right presentation. "Tyler, good to meet you," Hartwell said, gesturing toward a leather chair across from his desk. "Your phone call mentioned witnessing a disturbing incident involving threats and intimidation. Tell me exactly what happened." Tyler had rehearsed this conversation multiple times, crafting a story that would transform Franklin's act of kindness into something sinister while positioning himself as an innocent victim traumatized by witnessing criminal behavior. "I was walking home from work about 2 weeks ago when I saw this black mechanic threatening a young white Marine," Tyler began, his voice carefully modulated to convey distress. The Marine's bike had broken down on Highway 67, and this guy Franklin White lured him into his shop. I could see through the windows that he was getting aggressive, waving tools around, backing the soldier into a corner. Hartwell leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued by the racial dynamics Tyler was describing. "Did you hear what was said?" The Marine looked scared, kept saying, "Yes, sir," and trying to calm the situation down. Tyler continued, elaborating on his fabricated account. White was yelling about how military boys needed to learn respect, how he knew ways to handle people who crossed him. It was obvious he was using his size and the isolated location to intimidate this young soldier. None of this had happened. But Tyler delivered his lies with the conviction of someone who had convinced himself they contained some essential truth about what he believed Franklin was capable of, based purely on racial stereotypes and resentment. "This sounds like a clear case of criminal threatening, possibly even a hate crime," Hartwell said, already calculating potential settlement amounts. "But how does this create liability for the county?" Tyler smiled, revealing the centerpiece of his planned deception. "That's where it gets interesting. The only reason the Marine was vulnerable to this predator was because Highway 67's poor maintenance caused his motorcycle to break down. Potholes, inadequate signage, debris in the roadway. The county's negligence created the dangerous situation that put this soldier at risk." Hartwell's eyes lit up with the gleam of a man who saw profitable litigation on the horizon. "And you witnessed this entire encounter, suffering psychological trauma from seeing a veteran being threatened?" "I've barely slept since it happened," Tyler replied, manufacturing symptoms of distress. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that mechanic threatening to hurt that poor Marine. I've been having panic attacks, can't concentrate at work. My whole life has been affected by witnessing this violence." The attorney was already drafting potential legal strategies in his mind. A liability claim against Highland Park County, combined with criminal charges against Franklin White, could generate significant fees, especially if the case attracted media attention around issues of race and veteran affairs. "Tyler, I think we can help you seek justice for what you've experienced," Hartwell said, his tone becoming more professional. "The first step is reporting this criminal behavior to local law enforcement. Once we have documentation of the crime, we can pursue civil action against the county for creating the dangerous conditions that enabled it." Tyler left Hartwell's office with a clear plan and a referral to Detective Maria Powell, whom the attorney described as someone sympathetic to victims of violent crime. What Tyler didn't know was that Detective Powell had her own reasons for being interested in any criminal allegations against Franklin White. Detective Powell had been passed over for promotion 3 times in the past 5 years, watching less experienced officers advance, while she remained stuck investigating minor property crimes and domestic disputes. At 42, she was beginning to feel that her window for career advancement was closing, and she desperately needed a high-profile case that would demonstrate her investigative skills to the department leadership. When Tyler Bennett called to report witnessing criminal threats and intimidation, Powell saw an opportunity to build the kind of case that could finally get her the recognition she felt she deserved. A hate crime involving a veteran victim would generate media attention and demonstrate her ability to handle sensitive investigations. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate you coming forward with this information," Detective Powell said, as Tyler sat in the Highland Park Police Department's interview room. "Can you describe exactly what you observed on the evening of the incident?" Tyler repeated his fabricated story, this time adding even more details to make his account seem more credible. He described Franklin's alleged aggressive body language, quoted threatening statements that had never been made, and painted Derek as a victim, too frightened to resist or report the encounter himself. "Did you consider intervening to help the victim?" Powell asked, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "I wanted to, but I was scared," Tyler replied, projecting vulnerability. "This guy White is big, and he was talking about his military training, how he knew ways to hurt people. I was afraid if I got involved, he might turn on me too. Powell nodded sympathetically, already envisioning how this case could showcase her investigative abilities. Have you noticed any other suspicious activity around White's shop? Any pattern of intimidating behavior toward customers? Tyler had actually observed nothing but routine auto repair work and friendly customer interactions, but he sensed that Detective Powell wanted to hear about additional incidents that would strengthen the case against Franklin. Now that you mention it, I've seen him get pretty aggressive with some of his customers, Tyler said, manufacturing additional accusations, especially the older ones who can't fight back. He overcharges them, and when they complain, he gets threatening. I think he's been getting away with this kind of behavior for years. Detective Powell felt the familiar excitement that came with the early stages of what might become a major investigation. If Franklin White was systematically intimidating and overcharging vulnerable customers, particularly elderly residents, it would add additional criminal charges to the case and demonstrate a pattern of predatory behavior. Mr. Bennett, would you be willing to provide a formal written statement about what you witnessed? Powell asked. And would you be available to testify if this case goes to trial? Absolutely, Tyler replied without hesitation. Someone needs to hold this guy accountable before he really hurts someone. Over the following week, Detective Powell began building what she believed would be a career-defining case against Franklin White. She interviewed several of Franklin's elderly customers, asking leading questions about whether they had ever felt intimidated or overcharged. Most defended Franklin enthusiastically, describing him as honest and helpful, but Powell interpreted their loyalty as evidence that they were too frightened to admit the truth about his alleged intimidation tactics. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, when questioned about her recent brake repair, praised Franklin's fair pricing and respectful treatment. That young man Tyler must be confused about what he saw, she told Detective Powell. Franklin White is one of the most decent people in this town. But Powell heard what she wanted to hear, noting in her report that elderly victims often developed Stockholm Syndrome-like attachments to their abusers and might be reluctant to admit they had been victimized. Danny Martinez, the construction worker whose transmission Franklin had repaired on a payment plan, was equally defensive. Franklin saved my family when our truck broke down. He could have gouged us, but instead he worked with us on payments. Tyler Bennett is lying about whatever he thinks he saw. Detective Powell interpreted Danny's response as evidence of Franklin's manipulative control over vulnerable customers who depended on his services and couldn't afford to anger him by reporting his alleged misconduct. As Powell's investigation continued, word began spreading through Highland Park's small business community that Franklin White was under police scrutiny for criminal threatening and customer intimidation. The rumors, amplified by social media and local gossip networks, began affecting Franklin's business as some customers started questioning whether they should continue patronizing his shop. Franklin first became aware of the investigation when Officer Brad Cooper appeared at his shop on a busy Thursday afternoon, interrupting his work on a customer's car to ask questions about his interaction with Derek Stone 2 weeks earlier. Mr. White, we've received a report about an incident involving you and a Marine whose motorcycle broke down near your shop, Officer Cooper said, his tone professional but clearly suspicious. Can you tell me about your interaction with staff? Sergeant Derek Stone? Franklin looked up from the engine he was working on, confusion evident on his face. Derek Stone? The young Marine with the Harley? Sure, I remember him. Nice kid. Had a bad ignition control module. I helped him fix it so he could get back to his base. Did you have any kind of confrontation with Sergeant Stone? Cooper continued. Any heated words or threatening behavior? Threatening? Franklin's confusion deepened. Officer, I don't know. "What you've heard, but Derek and I had a completely friendly interaction. I fixed his bike for free and sent him on his way. There was nothing confrontational about it." Officer Cooper made notes in his notebook, his body language suggesting he didn't entirely believe Franklin's account. "We have a witness who says you were aggressive and intimidating toward Sergeant Stone, that you made threatening statements about your military background." Franklin felt a chill of recognition as he realized that someone had deliberately misrepresented his Good Samaritan act as something criminal. The familiar sensation of being judged and found guilty based on assumptions rather than facts brought back memories of other encounters with law enforcement over the years. "Officer Cooper, I don't know who told you that, but they're lying," Franklin said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing concern. "Derek Stone can confirm that I helped him fix his motorcycle and refused payment. There were no threats, no confrontation, nothing inappropriate about our interaction. We'll be contacting Sergeant Stone to get his version of events," Cooper replied. "In the meantime, Mr. White, I'd advise you to avoid any contact with the witness who reported this incident." After Officer Cooper left, Franklin stood in his shop trying to process what had just happened. Someone had witnessed his interaction with Derek Stone and had apparently told police that he had threatened the young Marine. The accusation was so far from reality that Franklin initially assumed there had been some kind of misunderstanding that could be easily cleared up once Derek was contacted. What Franklin didn't know was that Detective Powell had already attempted to reach Derek Stone at Camp Lejeune, only to discover that his unit had deployed to a classified location where communication with civilian law enforcement was severely restricted. Without Derek's testimony to contradict Tyler Bennett's accusations, Powell felt confident that she had enough evidence to pursue criminal charges. That evening, Franklin called his daughter Vanessa in Chicago to tell her about the police visit. He tried to keep his voice casual, not wanting to worry her unnecessarily, but Vanessa immediately picked up on the tension in his tone. "Dad, what exactly did this police officer want?" Vanessa asked, her nurse's training making her sensitive to signs of distress in people's voices. "Someone told the police I threatened a young Marine a couple weeks ago," Franklin explained. "You remember I mentioned helping that soldier with his motorcycle? Apparently someone saw us together and got the wrong idea about what was happening." Vanessa felt a knot forming in her stomach as she considered the implications of false accusations against her father. "Dad, did you call a lawyer? This sounds serious." "Vanessa, I didn't do anything wrong," Franklin replied, with the confidence of someone who believed that truth and justice were naturally aligned. "Once they talk to Derek Stone, this whole misunderstanding will be cleared up." But Franklin's faith in the system would soon be tested as Detective Powell's investigation gained momentum, Tyler Bennett's lies became more elaborate, and the machinery of Highland Park's criminal justice system began grinding toward what seemed like an inevitable conclusion. The simple act of helping a stranded veteran was being transformed into evidence of criminal behavior, and Franklin White was about to discover that being innocent was not always enough to protect him from those who had already decided he was guilty. As Franklin locked up his shop that evening, he noticed Tyler Bennett standing across the street, pretending to look at his phone while actually watching Franklin's every move. The young man's presence felt menacing in a way that Franklin couldn't quite articulate, but his military training had taught him to trust his instincts about potential threats. What Franklin couldn't have known was that Tyler was documenting his movements and behavior to support additional false allegations he was planning to make. The web of lies that would eventually destroy Franklin's freedom was still being woven, thread by thread, by a young man whose resentment and greed had combined to create a determination to destroy an innocent person's life. The stage was set for a collision between truth and lies. between a decent man's desire to help others and a corrupt system's willingness to believe the worst about people who didn't fit their assumptions about who deserved justice and who deserved punishment. District Attorney Amanda Richards stood before the bathroom mirror in her campaign headquarters, adjusting her navy blue blazer and practicing the facial expressions she would use during her upcoming press conference. At 45, Richards had built her political career on a carefully crafted image as Highland Park County's tough-on-crime prosecutor. And with the mayoral election just 8 months away, she needed a high-profile conviction to solidify her law and order credentials. The Franklin White case had landed on her desk at the perfect time. A black mechanic accused of threatening a white Marine veteran offered the kind of racially charged narrative that would resonate with Highland Park's predominantly white suburban voters, while allowing Richards to position herself as a defender of military service members and community safety. Amanda, the reporters are here, called Kevin Walsh, her ambitious young assistant prosecutor who saw the White case as his own ticket to career advancement. Channel 8, the Highland Park Gazette, and 3 radio stations. This is exactly the kind of media attention we need heading into campaign season. Richards nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before major public appearances. She had spent the morning reviewing Detective Powell's investigation file, which, while thin on actual evidence, painted a compelling picture of a dangerous individual who had used his military training to intimidate an innocent young soldier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richards began as she stepped before the assembled media in the courthouse's main lobby, "today I'm announcing criminal charges against Franklin White, a local business owner who allegedly used threats and intimidation against a United States Marine who was seeking help with a disabled vehicle." The cameras rolled as Richards outlined the charges: criminal threatening in the second degree, intimidation of a witness, and disorderly conduct. She carefully avoided mentioning that the witness, Tyler Bennett, had only come forward after consulting with a personal injury attorney, or that the alleged victim, Derek Stone, had not actually filed any complaint. This case sends a clear message that Highland Park County will not tolerate anyone who uses their size, their background, or their perceived authority to threaten and intimidate others. Richards continued, her voice carrying the righteous indignation that had made her a formidable courtroom presence. "Military veterans deserve our respect and protection, not victimization by predators who exploit their vulnerability." Jessica Anderson, the lead reporter for Channel 8 News, raised her hand. "Ms. Richards, can you provide details about the alleged threats? What specifically did Mr. White say to the Marine?" Richards had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that would maximize the emotional impact without technically misrepresenting the evidence. "According to our witness, Mr. White used his military background to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. He made statements about his combat experience and his knowledge of ways to handle people who didn't show proper respect. The victim was clearly frightened and felt he had no choice but to comply with Mr. White's demands." None of this was accurate, but Richards delivered it with the conviction of someone who had convinced herself that the broader narrative was true, even if specific details might be imprecise. In her mind, Franklin White represented a type of dangerous individual who needed to be stopped before his alleged intimidation tactics escalated into actual violence. Frank Williams, editor of the Highland Park Gazette, asked the follow-up question that Richards had been hoping for. "What message do you want to send to other business owners who might be tempted to take advantage of vulnerable customers?" "Business owners in Highland Park County have a responsibility to serve their customers with honesty and integrity," Richards replied, expanding the case beyond the specific allegations against Franklin. "When someone uses their position of power to intimidate and threaten others, especially our military heroes, They will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The press conference established the narrative that would dominate local media coverage for the next several weeks. Franklin White was presented as a predator who had targeted a vulnerable young Marine, using his military background not as a source of honor, but as a weapon for intimidation. The fact that Derek Stone had never claimed to be threatened or intimidated was lost in the broader story about protecting veterans from civilian predators. Meanwhile, Franklin sat in his shop watching the press conference on the small television. He kept in his office for background noise during slow periods. The surreal experience of hearing himself described as a dangerous criminal by the county's top prosecutor felt like watching someone else's life being destroyed on television. "This has got to be some kind of mistake," Franklin said aloud to his empty shop, his voice carrying disbelief rather than anger. "They're talking about me like I'm some kind of monster." The phone began ringing within minutes of the press conference ending. The first call came from Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, her elderly voice shaking with emotion. "Franklin, I just saw the news, and I want you to know that I don't believe a word of it," she said, her loyalty unwavering despite the serious charges being reported. "You've been nothing but kind and honest with me for over 10 years. Whatever this is about, it's not true." Similar calls followed throughout the afternoon. Danny Martinez called from his construction job to express support. Several other longtime customers reached out to offer encouragement and to promise they would continue bringing their vehicles to Franklin, despite the allegations. But for every call of support, Franklin could sense others who were staying silent, perhaps wondering if there might be some truth to the charges after all. The most painful call came from his brother James in Detroit, whose voice carried worry and confusion. "Franklin, what the hell is going on down there? The news is saying you threatened some Marine." "James, I helped a young soldier fix his motorcycle," Franklin explained for what felt like the 100th time. "Someone saw us together and made up a story about me threatening him. I don't understand why this is happening." "Brother, you need to get yourself a lawyer," James said urgently. "This kind of thing can destroy your life, even if you're innocent. Remember what happened to cousin Marcus up in Flint? False accusations, but by the time the truth came out, his business was ruined and his reputation was shot." Franklin knew his brother was right, but the reality of legal fees on his mechanic's budget felt overwhelming. Good criminal defense attorneys charged hundreds of dollars per hour, and Franklin's savings account held less than $3,000. The irony wasn't lost on him that helping Derek Stone for free might ultimately cost him everything he had worked to build. That evening, as Franklin was closing his shop, Tyler Bennett approached with a swagger that suggested he was enjoying his newfound importance as a key witness in a criminal case. Tyler had spent the afternoon giving interviews to local reporters, each time embellishing his fabricated account with additional details that made Franklin appear more threatening and Derek more victimized. "Looks like your chickens are coming home to roost, Franklin," Tyler said, positioning himself just outside Franklin's shop, but close enough to be clearly intimidating. "Maybe now people will see what kind of person you really are." Franklin studied the young man who had apparently decided to destroy his life for reasons that remained unclear. Tyler's body language radiated hostility and satisfaction, as if he was savoring Franklin's predicament. "Tyler, I don't know what I did to make you angry with me," Franklin said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing frustration. "But you know I never threatened that Marine. You saw me help him fix his bike and send him on his way." "That's not what I saw," Tyler replied with the confidence of someone who had repeated his lies so many times they felt like truth. "I saw you backing that soldier into a corner, threatening him, making him scared to say no to whatever you wanted." Franklin felt a chill of recognition as he realized that Tyler's accusations weren't based on misunderstanding or confusion, but on deliberate malice. The young man was intentionally lying about what he had witnessed, and no amount of truth or reason would change his story. "Why are you doing this to me?" Franklin asked, genuinely puzzled by Tyler's motivation for such destructive behavior. Tyler's expression shifted, revealing a glimpse of the resentment and racial hostility that actually drove his actions. "People like you get away with too much in this town. Always playing the victim, always expecting special treatment. It's time someone held you accountable." The conversation ended when Tyler walked away, leaving Franklin standing alone in his parking lot, with the understanding that he was facing an enemy who was determined to destroy him, regardless of truth or justice. The random act of kindness that had brought Derek Stone into his shop had somehow made him a target for someone whose hatred was deep enough to sustain an elaborate campaign of lies. The next morning brought Franklin's first direct contact with Highland Park County's criminal justice system when Detective Powell arrived at his shop with Officer Brad Cooper to conduct a formal interview. Powell carried a digital recorder and a notebook filled with questions designed to elicit admissions that could be used against Franklin in court. "Mr. White, we appreciate you agreeing to speak with us," Detective Powell began, her tone professional but clearly skeptical of anything Franklin might say in his defense. "We want to give you an opportunity to explain your side of what happened with Staff Sergeant Derek Stone." Franklin had considered refusing to speak without an attorney present, but his faith in his own innocence and his belief that truth would ultimately prevail convinced him to cooperate fully with the investigation. "Detective Powell, I'm happy to tell you exactly what happened," Franklin replied, settling into his office chair while the two officers remained standing in positions that felt subtly threatening. "Derek Stone's motorcycle broke down and he pushed it to my shop looking for help. I diagnosed the problem, found a used part that would fix it, and installed it for free. The whole interaction was friendly and professional." Our witness says, "You were aggressive and threatening towards Sergeant Stone," Powell continued, consulting her notes. "He says you used your military background to intimidate the young Marine." Franklin shook his head, his frustration beginning to show despite his efforts to remain calm. "Detective, that's completely false. Derek and I talked about our military service, but it was friendly conversation between veterans. I never threatened him or anyone else." Officer Cooper leaned forward, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Mr. White, lying to police officers during an official investigation is a crime. Are you sure you want to stick with that story?" "It's not a story, Officer Cooper," Franklin replied firmly. "It's the truth. I helped a young Marine fix his motorcycle so he could get back to his base on time. That's all that happened." Detective Powell made notes that Franklin couldn't see, but her expression suggested she was interpreting his denials as evidence of deception rather than honesty. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with the officers asking increasingly hostile questions based on Tyler Bennett's fabricated account, while Franklin maintained his truthful version of events. "Mr. White, we're going to need you to come to the station tomorrow morning to provide fingerprints and a formal statement," Detective Powell said as the interview concluded. "And I want to remind you that it's a crime to contact or intimidate witnesses in this case." After the officers left, Franklin sat alone in his shop, contemplating the reality that he was now officially a criminal defendant in Highland Park County's justice system. The police clearly believed Tyler Bennett's accusations despite their complete lack of supporting evidence, and Franklin was beginning to understand that his faith in truth and justice might be naive. The afternoon brought another devastating blow when Franklin received a certified letter from Highland Park County Bank informing him that his business loan was being called for immediate payment. The bank's letter didn't explicitly mention the criminal charges, but the timing made it clear that news of Franklin's legal troubles had reached his creditors. "Mr. White, this is Patricia Stevens from Highland Park County Bank," came the voice on Franklin's phone when he called to discuss the loan acceleration. "I'm calling regarding your commercial loan with us." "Miss Stevens, I received your letter about calling the loan," Franklin said, trying to keep desperation out of his voice. "My payments have always been on time, and the business has been profitable. Why are you demanding immediate payment?" "Mr. White, recent developments regarding your legal situation have caused the bank to reassess the risk associated with your loan," Stevens replied, in the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering bad news. "We feel it's in the bank's best interest to recover our investment before any potential criminal conviction affects your ability to operate your business." Franklin felt the walls closing in as he realized that the criminal charges were already destroying his livelihood even before any trial or conviction. Without his business, he would have no income to pay for legal defense, and without legal defense, he would be at the mercy of prosecutors who had already decided he was guilty. That evening, Franklin called his daughter Vanessa to update her on the rapidly deteriorating situation. He tried to sound optimistic, but Vanessa immediately detected the strain in his voice. "Dad, how much money do you have saved for legal expenses?" Vanessa asked, her nursing background making her direct. "About practical matters." "Not enough," Franklin admitted. "A good criminal defense attorney wants a $20,000 retainer, and I don't have that kind of money. The bank is calling my business loan, so even if I could raise the money, I'd need it to keep the shop open." Vanessa felt sick as she considered her father's situation. "Dad, Michael and I have some savings. We can help with legal fees." "Sweetheart, I can't ask you to spend your money on this," Franklin replied, though he was touched by his daughter's willingness to help. "You and Michael are saving for Tyler's college fund. I won't let these false charges destroy your family's future, too." As Franklin hung up the phone, he realized that he was facing the most serious crisis of his life, with limited resources and an opponent who seemed determined to destroy him, regardless of truth or justice. The simple act of helping Derek Stone had somehow transformed him from a respected small business owner into a criminal defendant whose freedom and livelihood hung in the balance. Outside his apartment window, Franklin could see Tyler Bennett's car parked across the street, its occupant apparently watching Franklin's building. The surveillance felt menacing and deliberate, as if Tyler wanted Franklin to know that his persecution was just beginning. The young man who had fabricated criminal charges was now apparently expanding his campaign of harassment to include stalking and intimidation. Franklin closed his blinds and tried to focus on preparing his own legal defense, but the evidence against him consisted entirely of Tyler Bennett's lies, and Franklin was beginning to understand that in Highland Park County's justice system, the truth might not be enough to save him from prosecution by ambitious officials who saw his case as a stepping stone to higher office. The Highland Park Community Center buzzed with tension as nearly 200 residents packed into folding, chairs arranged in rows facing a small stage where Mayor Richard Crawford sat behind a folding table with 3 city council members. The emergency town hall meeting had been called after a week of increasingly hostile social media posts and heated arguments in local businesses about Franklin White's criminal charges. Mayor Crawford, a heavyset man in his late 50s whose political survival depended on avoiding controversy, looked uncomfortable as he surveyed the crowd that had divided itself into visible factions. On one side sat Franklin's supporters, primarily elderly customers and fellow veterans who wore their service organization hats and pins. On the other side, a larger group of residents who had been influenced by the media coverage and Tyler Bennett's increasingly elaborate public statements about witnessing Franklin's alleged criminal behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to address community concerns about recent criminal charges filed against local business owner Franklin White, Mayor Crawford began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a politician trying not to alienate any voting bloc. While we cannot interfere with ongoing legal proceedings, we can discuss how these events affect our community's sense of safety and trust. The first speaker was Reverend Margaret Foster, Franklin's pastor at Highland Park Baptist Church, who approached the microphone with the dignity that had made her a respected voice in the community for over 20 years. I've known Franklin White for 15 years, and I'm here to tell you that the man being described in the news is not the Franklin White I know, Reverend Foster said, her voice carrying clearly through the community center. Franklin has volunteered countless hours helping elderly members of our congregation with car repairs they couldn't afford. He's mentored young people, supported veteran programs, and never asked for recognition or praise. Scattered applause came from Franklin's supporters, but it was quickly overwhelmed by murmurs of disapproval from the larger group that seemed to view any defense of Franklin as misguided loyalty that ignored obvious evidence of his criminal behavior. The next speaker was Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, who walked slowly to the microphone with the assistance of her walking cane. Her presence commanded respect from even Franklin's critics, as she was widely regarded as one of Highland Park's most upstanding citizens. I'm 84 years old, and I've been bringing my car to Franklin White for over 10 years, Mrs. Jackson began, her voice strong despite her age. If this man is supposed to be some kind of dangerous criminal who intimidates his customers, then I must be the worst judge of character in Highland Park County. Mrs. Jackson's testimonial was followed by similar statements from other longtime customers who described Franklin's honesty, fair pricing, and respectful treatment of everyone who entered his shop. Danny Martinez spoke about Franklin's willingness to work with customers who were struggling financially, while several other small business owners praised Franklin's integrity and community involvement. But the pro-Franklin testimony was systematically undermined by speakers who had been influenced by Tyler Bennett's media appearances and the prosecution's narrative about protecting the community from dangerous individuals who exploited their military backgrounds for criminal purposes. I don't care how nice this man seemed to his customers, declared Joyce Miller, a city council member whose re-election campaign had adopted a tough-on-crime platform. We have an eyewitness who saw him threaten a young Marine who was asking for help. That's not the kind of behavior we can tolerate in Highland Park. The reference to an eyewitness gave Tyler's fabricated accusations the weight of established fact, even though Derek Stone had never been contacted to confirm or deny Tyler's claims about being threatened or intimidated. The community was debating Franklin's guilt or innocence based entirely on Tyler's word, which had been amplified by media coverage and official prosecutorial statements. What really bothers me is that we're supposed to ignore criminal charges just because some people liked doing business with this guy, added Robert Hayes, a county commissioner whose own political ambitions required him to align with popular opinion. Criminals can be charming when it serves their purposes. That doesn't mean we should ignore their victims. The characterization of Derek Stone as a victim was particularly galling to Franklin's supporters, since Derek had never claimed to be victimized and remained unreachable for comment due to his military deployment. But the absence of the alleged victim allowed Tyler's narrative to stand unchallenged, and many community members accepted the prosecution's version of events as established truth. The most dramatic moment of the town hall came when Tyler Bennett himself took the microphone, having spent the week preparing remarks that would solidify his position as a brave whistleblower who had exposed a dangerous predator hiding in plain sight among Highland Park's business community. "I didn't want to come forward with what I saw," Tyler began, his voice carefully modulated to convey reluctance and civic duty. "I knew it would be my word against someone who's been in this community for years. But when I saw that young Marine being threatened and intimidated, I knew I couldn't stay silent." Tyler's performance was masterful, combining false humility with righteous indignation in a way that made his fabricated accusations sound like heroic truth-telling. He described watching through Franklin's shop windows as the mechanic, allegedly, used his size and military background to create an atmosphere of fear that left Derek Stone with no choice but to comply with whatever demands were being made. "This wasn't just about fixing a motorcycle," Tyler continued, building toward his climactic point. "This was about a predator who saw a vulnerable young soldier and decided to exploit that vulnerability. If I hadn't been there to witness it, who knows what might have happened to that Marine?" The implication that Franklin might have physically harmed Derek, if not for Tyler's presence, was completely fabricated, but it had the desired effect of making Franklin appear even more dangerous, while positioning Tyler as Derek's protector. Several people in the audience nodded approvingly, apparently convinced that Tyler's intervention had prevented a violent crime. The town hall meeting ended with Mayor Crawford promising a thorough review of business licensing procedures and enhanced police patrols in commercial areas. Responses that suggested official acceptance of Tyler's accusations, while carefully avoiding any commitment to specific actions that might later prove embarrassing if Franklin was vindicated. As the crowd filed out of the community center, Franklin's supporters clustered around Reverend Foster and Mrs. Jackson, their faces showing the strain of defending someone they believed in against a community that seemed increasingly convinced of his guilt. The larger group of Franklin's critics left with satisfied expressions, feeling that justice was being served and their community was being protected from a dangerous individual. Franklin himself had not attended the town hall meeting, having been advised by the public defender who had finally been assigned to his case that any public appearance might be used against him by prosecutors looking for evidence of witness intimidation or attempts to influence public opinion. Instead, he spent the evening in his small apartment, watching local news coverage of the meeting and feeling increasingly isolated from the community he had served faithfully for 15 years. The news coverage focused heavily on Tyler's testimony, with Channel 8 running a segment titled "Hero Witness Speaks Out About Veteran Violence" that portrayed Tyler as a courageous citizen who had risked personal safety to protect a military service member from a dangerous predator. The report included no mention of Franklin's supporters or any suggestion that Tyler's accusations might be questionable. The following morning brought Franklin face to face with the Highland Park County justice system when he appeared for arraignment before Judge Spencer in a courtroom packed with media representatives and curious citizens who wanted to see the man accused of threatening a Marine veteran. Judge Spencer, a 67-year-old former prosecutor whose 30-year career had been built on maintaining order and moving cases efficiently through the system, read the charges in a monotone voice that suggested this was routine business rather than a case that might destroy an innocent man's life. "Mr. White, you are charged with criminal threatening in the second degree, intimidation of a witness, and disorderly conduct," Judge Spencer announced, consulting the file that contained Detective Powell's investigation report and Tyler Bennett's formal statement. "How do you plead to these charges?" Franklin's court-appointed attorney, Lisa Chen, was a 29-year-old public defender whose caseload of over 100 active cases left her with minimal time to investigate the specific facts of any individual case. She had reviewed Franklin's file for less than an hour before the arraignment and had already concluded that negotiating a plea bargain would be more realistic than fighting charges supported by eyewitness testimony. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Franklin said clearly, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who knew he had done nothing wrong and believed that the truth would eventually prevail. Judge Spencer set bail at $25,000, an amount that Franklin could not possibly raise without putting up his shop as collateral. The bail amount effectively ensured that Franklin would remain in custody unless he was willing to risk losing his business, the only asset he possessed that might generate enough equity to secure his release. "Your Honor, my client is a lifelong resident of Highland Park with no criminal record and strong ties to the community," Lisa Chen argued, making a routine motion for reduced bail. "He poses no flight risk and should be released on his own recognizance." "Ms. Chen, your client is accused of using threats and intimidation against a military service member," Judge Spencer replied, his tone suggesting that the charges themselves were sufficient justification for substantial bail. "The court has a responsibility to ensure community safety and the integrity of the legal process." The bail decision meant that Franklin would spend the weeks leading up to his trial in Highland Park County Jail, unable to operate his business or earn income to pay for his legal defense. The financial pressure would be enormous, and Lisa Chen knew that most defendants in Franklin's situation eventually accepted plea bargains that allowed them to avoid lengthy prison sentences, even if it meant admitting guilt for crimes they hadn't committed. As Franklin was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, the assembled media representatives captured images that would dominate local news coverage for the next several days. The sight of a black man in custody for threatening a white Marine veteran reinforced the prosecution's narrative while making Franklin appear guilty even before his trial began. Tyler Bennett watched from the courtroom gallery with obvious satisfaction, having achieved his goal of seeing Franklin arrested and publicly humiliated. The personal injury lawsuit against Highland Park County was proceeding smoothly, with attorney Jason Hartwell confident that Tyler's status as a key witness in a criminal case would strengthen their civil claim for damages related to the county's alleged negligence in maintaining safe road conditions. In Highland Park County Jail, Franklin was processed through the same dehumanizing intake procedure that transformed citizens into inmates. His personal belongings were confiscated, his clothing was replaced with an orange jumpsuit, and he was assigned to a cell with 2 other men awaiting trial on various charges. Franklin's cellmate, a 24-year-old named Marcus Williams, who was facing drug possession charges, initially viewed the older man with suspicion until he learned about Franklin's military background and the circumstances of his arrest. "So you're the mechanic who helped that Marine and got arrested for it?" Marcus asked, after Franklin had been in the cell for several hours. "That's what they say I did," Franklin replied, sitting on the narrow bunk that would be his bed for the foreseeable future. "Truth is, I just fixed his motorcycle and sent him on his way." Marcus shook his head with the cynical wisdom of someone who had grown up understanding that the justice system operated differently for different types of people. "Man, they'll lock us up for breathing while black. System don't care about truth, just about who's got the better story." The conversation with Marcus helped Franklin begin to understand that his faith in truth and justice might be naive in a system where political ambition and racial prejudice could overwhelm facts and evidence. The simple act of helping Derek Stone had somehow transformed him from a respected community member into a criminal defendant whose freedom depended on convincing 12 strangers that he was innocent of crimes he had never even contemplated committing. As Franklin lay on his jail bunk that first night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of other inmates dealing with their own legal troubles, he began to comprehend the full scope of what he was facing. Tyler Bennett's lies had been accepted as truth by police, prosecutors, and much of the Highland Park community. The media had transformed him into a symbol of veteran violence and predatory behavior. His business was closed, his savings were depleted, and his reputation was destroyed. But even in the depths of Highland Park County Jail, Franklin White maintained the dignity and principles that had defined his character throughout his military service and civilian life. He had helped Derek Stone because it was the right thing to do, and he would continue to tell the truth about that interaction, regardless of the consequences. What Franklin could not have known was that thousands of miles away, Derek Stone was trying desperately to contact American authorities about the false charges being filed against the man who had helped him. Military communication restrictions and the classified nature of Derek's deployment were preventing him from providing the testimony that could immediately vindicate Franklin. But Derek had not forgotten the kindness shown to him by a fellow, a veteran, and he was determined to set the record straight as soon as military regulations allowed. Emma Stone sat in her cramped Chicago apartment, surrounded by stacks of newspapers, printed emails, and handwritten notes as she conducted her own investigation into the charges against Franklin White. As an investigative journalist for the Tribune, Emma had initially planned to write a straightforward piece about her brother Derek's experience, being helped by a Highland Park mechanic, but the criminal charges against Franklin had transformed her story into something much more significant. Derek's frantic phone calls from his classified deployment location had convinced Emma that something was seriously wrong with the prosecution's case. Her brother had described Franklin White as helpful and generous, not threatening or intimidating, and Derek was desperate to return home to testify on Franklin's behalf. Military regulations prevented Derek from providing detailed information about his mission or timeline for return, but he had made it clear that the charges against Franklin were completely false. "Emma, you have to understand. This man saved my career," Derek had said during their last brief conversation over a crackling military satellite connection. "My bike broke down and he fixed it for free so I could get back to base on time. He never threatened me, never made me uncomfortable, never did anything except help a fellow veteran who needed it." Emma's investigation had revealed troubling inconsistencies in the prosecution's case that other reporters had either missed or chosen to ignore. Tyler Bennett's background included 2 arrests for filing false police reports. Both charges dropped when his supposed victims failed to pursue prosecution. His current employment at a fast food restaurant followed a pattern of brief jobs ended by conflicts with supervisors and co-workers who described him as resentful and prone to fabricating grievances. More disturbing was Emma's discovery that Tyler had consulted with personal injury attorney Jason Hartwell before reporting the alleged crime to police. Public records showed that Hartwell and Associates had filed a liability claim against Highland Park County on Tyler's behalf, seeking damages for psychological trauma allegedly caused by witnessing Franklin's supposed criminal behavior. The timing suggested that Tyler's accusations against Franklin were motivated by financial opportunity rather than genuine concern for Derek's safety. Emma's investigation had also uncovered District Attorney Amanda Richards's political motivations for aggressively prosecuting Franklin. Richards was trailing in early polling for the mayoral race, and her campaign had specifically highlighted the Franklin White case in fundraising appeals that described her as a prosecutor willing to hold dangerous veterans accountable for criminal behavior. The case had generated significant donations from suburban voters who viewed Richards as a defender of community safety against urban crime. Armed with this evidence, Emma drove to Highland Park to interview Franklin's supporters and investigate the community dynamics that had allowed Tyler's fabricated accusations to gain such widespread acceptance. Her first stop was White's Automotive, where she found the shop locked and empty, a closed indefinitely sign posted on the front door. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, whom Emma interviewed at her modest home near downtown Highland Park, provided a perspective on Franklin that contrasted sharply with the prosecution's portrayal of him as a dangerous predator who intimidated vulnerable customers. "Franklin White is one of the finest men I've ever known," Mrs. Jackson said, serving Emma tea in her small living room filled with photographs of grandchildren and late husband. "He's worked on my car for over 10 years, and he's never been anything but respectful and honest. This whole business is ridiculous." Mrs. Jackson's account of Franklin's character was supported by similar testimonials from other long-time customers who described a pattern of fair pricing, quality work, and special consideration for elderly and financially struggling clients. These were not the behaviors Emma would expect from someone who routinely used intimidation tactics to exploit vulnerable customers. "Has Tyler Bennett ever been a customer of Mr. White's shop?" Emma asked, curious about the relationship between Franklin and his accuser. "Tyler Bennett is a troublemaker who's never owned a car worth fixing," Mrs. Jackson replied with obvious disapproval. "His family has money, so he drives whatever his parents buy him. I can't imagine why he would have been at Franklin's shop unless he was looking for trouble." Emma's interview with Danny Martinez, the construction worker whose transmission Franklin had repaired on a payment plan, revealed additional information about Tyler's motivations for targeting Franklin. "Tyler's got issues with successful black folks in this town," Danny explained as they sat in his pickup truck outside the construction site where he worked. "He's been complaining for years about how Franklin gets respect while he can't hold a job. This whole thing smells like payback to me." The picture that emerged from Emma's investigation was of a resentful young man who had fabricated criminal charges against Franklin as part of a scheme to profit from a civil lawsuit, while simultaneously destroying someone he viewed as receiving undeserved community respect. Tyler's accusations had found fertile ground in Highland Park's racial tensions and residents' willingness to believe negative stereotypes about black veterans. Emma's most important discovery came when she visited the Highland Park Police Department to request copies of the investigation reports. Detective Maria Powell initially refused to discuss the case, citing ongoing legal proceedings, but Emma's persistence and questions about specific inconsistencies in Tyler's statement eventually prompted Powell to become defensive. "Mr. Bennett has been completely consistent in his account of what he witnessed," Detective Powell insisted, though her tone suggested less confidence than her words conveyed. "We've conducted a thorough investigation and are confident in the strength of our case." "Detective Powell, did you attempt to interview Staff Sergeant Derek Stone before filing charges?" Emma asked, consulting her notes. "He's the alleged victim, but there's no record of any statement from him in the court documents." Powell's hesitation before answering revealed the weakness in the prosecution's case. "Staff Sergeant Stone has been deployed to a classified location where communication with civilian law enforcement is restricted. We expect to interview him when he returns." "But you filed criminal charges based solely on Mr. Bennett's statement, without ever speaking to the person who was supposedly threatened," Emma pressed. "Mr. Bennett is a credible witness who provided detailed testimony about what he observed," Powell replied, but her discomfort was obvious. "We don't always need victim statements to pursue criminal charges when we have reliable eyewitness testimony." Emma left the police station understanding that Franklin's prosecution was based entirely on Tyler Bennett's fabricated accusations, with no corroborating evidence or victim testimony to support the charges. The weakness of the case suggested that Franklin should be able to defend himself successfully, but Emma knew that jury trials were unpredictable, especially when racial bias and political pressure influenced community opinion. Meanwhile, in Highland, Park County Jail, Franklin was struggling to maintain his physical and mental health under the stress of incarceration. The jail's medical staff had noted elevated blood pressure and signs of depression, but treatment options were limited in the correctional facility's understaffed healthcare system. Franklin's cellmate, Marcus Williams, had become an unexpected source of support, offering practical advice about surviving jail while maintaining dignity and hope. Marcus's own legal troubles had given him insight into the realities of the criminal justice system that Franklin was only beginning to understand. "The thing you got to remember, Mr. White, is that this system ain't about truth or justice," Marcus explained during one of their long conversations in the cramped cell they shared. "It's about who's got the best story and the most power to make people believe it." "But I didn't do anything wrong," Franklin replied, still struggling to accept that innocence might not be sufficient protection against false accusations. "Derek Stone can tell them I helped him, not threatened him." "Yeah, but where is Derek Stone?" Marcus asked with the practical wisdom of someone who understood that being right and being vindicated were not the same thing. "Your word against that Tyler boy's word, and which one of you looks more like what these folks expect a criminal to look like?" The conversation forced Franklin to confront the reality that his prosecution was as much about race and class as it was about the specific allegations Tyler had made. Highland Park's predominantly white jury pool would be asked to choose between believing a young white man who claimed to be protecting a Marine veteran and believing a middle-aged black man who insisted he had done nothing wrong. Franklin's daughter Vanessa visited him twice during his first week in jail, each visit more heartbreaking than the last, as she watched her father's spirit being crushed by the systematic destruction of his reputation and livelihood. "Dad, Michael and I have been talking, and we want to hire you a private attorney," Vanessa said during their second visit, speaking through the plexiglass barrier that separated inmates from visitors. "The public defender system isn't designed to handle complex cases like this. Vanessa, I can't ask you to spend your savings on legal fees," Franklin replied, though the inadequacy of his court-appointed representation was becoming increasingly obvious. "Lisa Chen is doing her best with the resources she has." "Dad, Lisa Chen has barely spent an hour reviewing your case," Vanessa said, her frustration evident. "She's already talking about plea bargains and reduced sentences. You need someone who believes in your innocence and is willing to fight for it." Franklin knew his daughter was right, but accepting her financial help felt like another defeat in a case that had already cost him his business, his freedom, and his reputation. The irony wasn't lost on him that helping Derek Stone for free might ultimately cost his family their life savings. "What does Tyler Bennett gain from lying about me?" Franklin asked, genuinely puzzled by the motivation for such destructive false accusations. Vanessa had been researching Tyler's background and had discovered the same information that Emma Stone was uncovering through her investigation. "Dad, he's filed a lawsuit against the county, claiming that dangerous road conditions put him at risk of witnessing criminal activity. If he can convince a jury that you're a dangerous criminal, his settlement could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." The revelation that Tyler's accusations were part of an elaborate financial scheme rather than genuine concern for Derek's safety added another layer of injustice to Franklin's situation. He was being destroyed by someone whose only motivation was personal profit, and the criminal justice system was serving as Tyler's unwitting accomplice in this fraud. As Franklin's trial date approached, the media coverage continued to present him as a dangerous veteran whose military training had made him a threat to civilian safety. Channel 8 ran a week-long series titled When Veterans Attack that featured interviews with psychiatrists who had never met Franklin but were willing to speculate about the psychological factors that might drive veterans to commit violent crimes. The series included no mention of Franklin's spotless record as a business owner, his volunteer work with veteran organizations, or his reputation for helping community members in financial distress. Instead, viewers were presented with a narrative about dangerous veterans who used their military backgrounds to intimidate and exploit innocent civilians. Tyler Bennett appeared in multiple segments, each time presenting himself as a reluctant hero who had risked personal safety to protect Derek Stone from a predatory veteran. His performances became more polished with each appearance, and his fabricated account of witnessing Franklin's alleged threats became more detailed and emotionally compelling. "I keep thinking about what might have happened to that young Marine if I hadn't been there to witness what was going on," Tyler said during one particularly dramatic interview. "This guy, Franklin White, is trained to kill, and he was using that training to terrorize someone who was just asking for help." The characterization of Franklin as a trained killer who was terrorizing Derek became a central theme in media coverage, despite the complete absence of any evidence that Franklin had ever threatened anyone or used his military background for intimidation purposes. The narrative was powerful because it played into existing stereotypes about dangerous black men and unstable veterans, allowing viewers to feel justified in their prejudices while believing they were concerned about community safety. Meanwhile, Derek Stone continued his desperate attempts to contact American authorities from his classified deployment location. Military communication protocols severely restricted his ability to provide detailed information about civilian legal proceedings, but Derek had managed to send brief messages through official channels indicating that criminal charges had been filed against someone who had helped him and that those charges were completely false. The messages had reached Pentagon officials responsible for maintaining communication between deployed service members and civilian authorities. But the bureaucratic process for handling such communications was slow and complicated. Derek's commanding officers were reluctant to become involved in civilian legal proceedings that might compromise operational security, and the classified nature of Derek's mission made it impossible for him to return to the United States for trial testimony. As Franklin's trial approached, the convergence of Tyler's fabricated accusations, ambitious prosecutors seeking political advantage, racial bias in Highland Park's community, and Derek's inability to provide exonerating testimony had created a perfect storm of injustice that threatened to destroy an innocent man's life. The stage was set for a legal proceeding that would test whether truth and justice could prevail against lies supported by prejudice and political ambition, or whether Franklin White would become another victim of a system that valued narrative over facts and assumption over evidence. The Highland Park County Courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Franklin White's trial began on a cold Tuesday morning. In November, every seat in Judge Spencer's courtroom was filled with residents who had followed the case through weeks of media coverage, while additional spectators stood along the walls and spilled into the corridor outside. The case had become a symbol of larger tensions about race, military service, and community safety that extended far beyond the specific allegations against Franklin. District Attorney Amanda Richards entered the courtroom wearing a charcoal gray suit that conveyed both authority and empathy, her campaign consultants having advised her that the right appearance could influence jury perception as much as legal arguments. She carried a thick briefcase filled with exhibits and witness statements that would paint Franklin as a dangerous predator who had used his military background to terrorize an innocent Marine seeking help. Franklin sat at the defense table beside Public Defender Lisa Chen, his orange jumpsuit replaced by an ill-fitting borrowed suit that emphasized his status as an accused criminal rather than the respected business owner he had been just months earlier. The weight loss from jail food and stress had made his clothes hang loosely, while the fluorescent courtroom lighting highlighted the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. Judge Spencer called the court to order and began the jury selection process that would determine Franklin's fate. The jury pool consisted primarily of Highland Park residents, whose opinions about the case had been shaped by months of media coverage portraying Franklin as a threatening veteran who had exploited Derek Stone's vulnerability. Ladies and gentlemen, this case involves serious criminal charges against the defendant Franklin White, Judge Spencer explained to the potential jurors. Mr. White is accused of using threats and intimidation against a United States Marine who was seeking automotive assistance. Can any of you think of reasons why you could not be fair and impartial in evaluating the evidence? Several potential jurors raised their hands, admitting they had already formed opinions about Franklin's guilt based on news reports and community discussions. But Richard's challenges eliminated most of Franklin's potential supporters, while Chen's limited experience in jury selection left her unable to identify subtle biases that could influence the verdict. The final jury consisted of 8 white residents from Highland Park's suburban neighborhoods, 2 white residents from surrounding rural areas, 1 Hispanic construction worker, and 1 black woman who worked as a grocery store cashier. The composition virtually guaranteed that Franklin would be judged by people who had little understanding of his background or the community he had served for 15 years. Richard's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that transformed Tyler Bennett's fabricated accusations into a compelling narrative about protecting vulnerable veterans from civilian predators who exploited their military training for criminal purposes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a young Marine who made the mistake of trusting someone he thought was a fellow veteran. Richards began, her voice carrying the moral authority that had made her a successful prosecutor. Staff Sergeant Derek Stone's motorcycle broke down on a lonely stretch of Highway 67, and when Franklin White offered to help, Derek thought he was encountering the brotherhood that exists among military veterans. Richards paused dramatically, allowing the jury to absorb the image of Derek as a vulnerable young soldier who had been betrayed by someone who should have protected him. But Franklin White saw Derek Stone not as a fellow veteran deserving respect and assistance, but as an opportunity to demonstrate his power and dominance, Richards continued, her voice rising with indignation. Using his size, his military background, and his isolated shop location, Franklin White transformed what should have been a simple automotive repair into a terrifying ordeal that left Derek Stone too frightened to resist or report what had happened to him. The characterization of Franklin's free motorcycle repair as a terrifying ordeal was completely fabricated, but Richards delivered it with such conviction that several jurors took notes, apparently accepting her version of events as established fact rather than prosecution theory. Tyler Bennett happened to be walking past Franklin White's shop that afternoon, and what he witnessed through the windows shocked him, Richard said, beginning the portion of her opening that would establish Tyler as a heroic citizen who had risked personal safety to protect Derek. He saw Franklin White backing Derek Stone into a corner, waving tools in a threatening manner, and making statements about his military experience that clearly conveyed his ability and willingness to hurt anyone who didn't show proper submission. Again, none of this had actually happened, but Richard's description was vivid enough to create visual images in the jurors' minds that would be difficult to dislodge once they began deliberating. Tyler Bennett faced a choice that night. Richards continued, building toward her emotional climax. He could walk away and pretend he hadn't seen a young Marine being terrorized by a predator, or he could find the courage to come forward and ensure that Franklin White was held accountable for his criminal behavior. The transformation of Tyler's profit-motivated lies into heroic truth-telling was perhaps the most cynical aspect of Richard's opening, but it established the moral framework that would guide the jury's evaluation of conflicting testimony throughout the trial. Lisa Chen's opening statement was hampered by her limited preparation time and her client's inability to afford the kind of thorough investigation that might have exposed Tyler's motivations and background. Her presentation was factual, but lacked the emotional resonance that made Richard's fabricated narrative so compelling. Ladies and gentlemen, Franklin White is a 58-year-old mechanic who has operated an honest business in Highland Park for 15 years, Chen began, her voice lacking the confidence that comes from adequate preparation. On the day in question, he did exactly what he has done thousands of times before. He helped a customer fix a mechanical problem so they could continue their journey. Chen's description of Franklin's interaction with Derek was accurate but unexciting, failing to counter Richard's dramatic portrayal of the encounter as a criminal assault. Without Derek's testimony to confirm Franklin's version of events, Chen was forced to rely on her client's word against Tyler's more elaborate accusations. Mr. Bennett claims to have witnessed threatening behavior, but you will hear no testimony from Staff Sergeant Derek Stone claiming that he was threatened or intimidated, Chen said, attempting to highlight the weakness in the prosecution's case. The alleged victim in this case has never complained about his treatment by Franklin White, and the only person claiming that criminal behavior occurred is someone who was not present for the conversation between Mr. White and Sergeant Stone. Chen's point about Derek's absence was legally sound, but emotionally weak, especially since Richards had already explained that Derek's military deployment prevented him from testifying. The jury was more likely to view Derek's absence as unfortunate rather than evidence that no crime had occurred. The prosecution's first witness was Tyler Bennett himself, dressed in a conservative suit and carrying himself with the nervous dignity of someone who claimed to be performing an unpleasant civic duty. His testimony had been rehearsed extensively with Richards and her staff, and every detail had been crafted to maximize emotional impact while maintaining technical credibility. Mr. Bennett, can you tell the jury what you observed on the afternoon of September 15th at Franklin White's automotive shop? Richards asked, beginning the direct examination that would establish Tyler's fabricated version of events as the foundation for Franklin's conviction. I was walking home from work when I heard raised voices coming from the garage, Tyler began, his voice carefully modulated to convey reluctance and distress. I looked through the windows and saw Mr. White standing over a young man in military uniform who looked scared and trapped. Tyler's description of Franklin standing over Derek was designed to emphasize size and physical intimidation, even though Franklin had actually been kneeling beside Derek's motorcycle throughout most of their interaction. What was Mr. White doing that made you concerned for the young Marine's safety? Richards prompted. He was waving a wrench in an aggressive manner, getting closer and closer to the soldier, who kept backing away, Tyler replied, adding fictional details that made Franklin appear violent and Derek appear victimized. The Marine had his hands up in a defensive position, like he was trying to calm the situation down. None of this had occurred, but Tyler's vivid description created a visual narrative that was easy for jurors to imagine and difficult to forget. Did you hear what Mr. White was saying to the Marine? Richards asked. He kept talking about his military background, how he had learned ways to handle disrespectful people in combat zones, Tyler testified, fabricating quotes that made Franklin sound threatening. He said young soldiers needed to learn proper respect for their elders, and that local police couldn't protect everyone all the time. The fictional quotes were particularly damaging because they suggested that Franklin had not only threatened Derek, but had also claimed to be beyond the reach of law enforcement. Tyler's performance was so convincing that several jurors visibly reacted with shock and disapproval. Lisa Chen's cross-examination of Tyler was hampered by her limited investigation into his background and motivations. Without knowledge of his personal injury lawsuit or his history of filing false reports, she was unable to expose the financial incentives behind his accusations. "Mr. Bennett, how far away were you when you allegedly observed this interaction?" Chen asked, attempting to challenge Tyler's ability to see and hear details through the shop's windows. "About 50 feet, Tyler replied confidently, "close enough to see everything clearly." "And you're certain about the specific words you claim to have heard Mr. White speak?" Chen continued. "Absolutely certain," Tyler said, maintaining eye contact with the jury. "Those words are burned into my memory because of how shocking they were." Chen's questioning revealed Tyler's certainty but failed to expose the fabricated nature of his testimony. Without Derek Stone present to contradict Tyler's account, the jury was left to choose between Franklin's word and Tyler's more detailed accusations. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Detective Maria Powell, who presented her investigation as thorough and professional, despite its obvious shortcomings. Powell's uniform and badge gave her testimony official weight that reinforced Tyler's accusations while making Franklin's denials appear self-serving. Detective Powell, did Mr. White admit to having military experience during your interview with him? Richards asked. Yes, he confirmed that he had served in the army and had been deployed overseas, Powell replied, making Franklin's military service sound suspicious rather than honorable. Did his demeanor during the interview suggest someone who might be capable of the threatening behavior described by Mr. Bennett? Chen objected to the speculative nature of the question, but Judge Spencer allowed Powell to answer based on her experience evaluating criminal suspects. Mr. White was calm and controlled throughout the interview, which is consistent with someone who has military training in managing confrontational situations, Powell testified, twisting Franklin's composed behavior into evidence of his supposed dangerousness. The most damaging testimony came when Richards called Dr. Patricia Griffin, a military psychiatrist who had never met Franklin, but was willing to provide expert opinion about the psychological factors that might drive veterans to commit violent crimes. Dr. Griffin, in your professional opinion, are veterans with combat experience more likely than civilians to use intimidation and threats to resolve conflicts? Richards asked. Combat veterans have been trained to use force and aggression in high-stress situations, Dr. Griffin replied, her credentials lending authority to generalizations that painted all veterans as potentially dangerous. Some individuals may have difficulty transitioning those skills to civilian environments where such behaviors are inappropriate. Chen's objection that Dr. Griffin had never examined Franklin was sustained, but the damage was done. The jury had heard an expert witness essentially declare that Franklin's military background made him more likely to commit the crimes Tyler had described. As the prosecution rested its case, Franklin sat in the defendant's chair, understanding that Tyler's lies had been transformed into a coherent narrative that portrayed him as a dangerous predator who had exploited Derek Stone's vulnerability. The jury had heard no testimony from Derek himself, no evidence of Franklin's actual character, and no explanation of Tyler's financial motivations for fabricating criminal charges. The defense case would depend entirely on Franklin's own testimony and Chen's ability to create reasonable doubt about Tyler's accusations. But Franklin was beginning to understand that in Highland Park County's justice system, being innocent might not be enough to save him from conviction by a jury that had already been convinced of his guilt. by skilled prosecutors who valued political advancement over truth. The evening news coverage emphasized Tyler's emotional testimony and Dr. Griffin's expert opinion about dangerous veterans, while barely mentioning Chen's attempts to challenge the prosecution's narrative. Channel 8's legal analyst predicted that Franklin would likely be convicted based on the strength of the eyewitness testimony and the absence of any credible alternative explanation for Tyler's accusations. As Franklin returned to his jail cell that night, he knew that his fate now rested with 12 strangers who had spent the day hearing expertly crafted lies about his character and conduct. The simple act of helping Derek Stone had somehow transformed him into the central figure in a criminal trial that might destroy not only his freedom, but also his daughter's faith in the justice system they had both been taught to respect. Franklin White's testimony began on the trial's third day with Lisa Chen's nervous attempt to present her client as a decent man whose act of kindness had been twisted into criminal behavior by false accusations and prosecutorial ambition. The courtroom remained packed with spectators who had followed every detail of the case, while news cameras positioned outside captured the dramatic moments for evening broadcasts that would shape public opinion about the verdict. "Mr. White, please tell the jury about your interaction with Staff Sergeant Derek Stone on September 15th, Chen began, her voice lacking the confidence that comes from adequate preparation and strong evidence. Franklin looked directly at the jury as he spoke, his military bearing evident despite months of incarceration and stress. Derek Stone's motorcycle broke down and he pushed it to my shop looking for help. I diagnosed the problem as a failed ignition control module, found a compatible part in my inventory and installed it free of charge so he could get back to his base on time. The simple, truthful account sounded almost anticlimactic after Tyler Bennett's dramatic testimony about threats and intimidation. Franklin's matter-of-fact description failed to generate the emotional response that might have countered the prosecution's narrative. "Did you at any time threaten Staff Sergeant Stone or make him feel uncomfortable in any way?" Chen asked. "No, ma'am," Franklin replied firmly. "Our entire interaction was friendly and professional. We talked about our military service and I was glad to help a fellow veteran who needed assistance. Mr. White, Tyler Bennett testified that he saw you waving tools in a threatening manner and backing Sergeant Stone into a corner. Did any of that happen?" "None of that happened," Franklin said, his voice carrying conviction that should have been persuasive but somehow lacked the dramatic impact of Tyler's fabricated testimony. "I was working on Derek's motorcycle the entire time." Tyler Bennett is lying about what he claims he saw. The direct accusation that Tyler was lying was necessary but risky, as it forced the jury to choose between Franklin's word and Tyler's without providing them any evidence to support Franklin's version of events. Without Derek Stone's testimony or documentation of Tyler's financial motivations, Franklin's denial carried little weight against Tyler's detailed accusations. District Attorney Richards approached the cross-examination with the confidence of a prosecutor who knew she held all the advantages. Her questions were designed to portray Franklin as an angry man whose military training made him dangerous while his denials made him appear dishonest. "Mr. White, you served multiple tours in Afghanistan, correct?" Richards began, making Franklin's military service sound ominous rather than honorable. "Yes, ma'am. I served 4 tours as a combat engineer," Franklin replied, unaware that his honest answer was being used against him. "Combat engineers are trained in the use of explosives and demolition techniques, aren't they?" Chen objected that Franklin's military training was irrelevant to the charges, but Judge Spencer overruled the objection, allowing Richards to continue painting Franklin as someone whose specialized military skills made him inherently threatening. "Were you trained in hand-to-hand combat and weapons handling during your military service?" Richards continued. "All soldiers receive basic combat training," Franklin replied, his answers becoming more cautious as he realized that his military background was being twisted into evidence against him. So when you encountered Staff Sergeant Stone, you were someone with extensive training in violence and intimidation, facing a young Marine who was alone and vulnerable, correct? That's not how I saw the situation at all, Franklin protested. I saw a fellow veteran who needed help, and I provided it. Richard's questioning continued for over an hour, methodically undermining Franklin's credibility, while reinforcing the prosecution's narrative that his military background made him dangerous. Every aspect of Franklin's service that should have been viewed as honorable was reframed as evidence of his capacity for violence and intimidation. Mr. White, isn't it true that you've struggled financially in recent years, operating a failing business that required you to seek special payment arrangements with customers? Richards asked, shifting to questions about Franklin's economic circumstances. My business has faced challenges, but I've always honored my commitments to customers, Franklin replied, unaware that his financial struggles were being portrayed as motivation for desperate behavior. Desperate financial circumstances might make someone more likely to exploit vulnerable customers, wouldn't they? Chen's objection was sustained, but the question had achieved its purpose of suggesting that Franklin's economic pressures had driven him to criminal behavior. The jury heard the implication, even though they were instructed to disregard the specific question. The most damaging moment of cross-examination came when Richards confronted Franklin with Tyler's specific claims about threatening statements. Mr. White, Tyler Bennett testified that you told Staff Sergeant Stone that you knew ways to handle disrespectful people from your combat experience. Did you make any such statement? I never said anything like that, Franklin replied truthfully. He also testified that you said local police couldn't protect everyone all the time. Did you make that statement? No, I did not. So your testimony is that Tyler Bennett fabricated all of these specific quotes from your conversation with Sergeant Stone? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, Franklin answered, knowing he had no choice but to directly accuse Tyler of perjury. Mr. White, why? Would Tyler Bennett risk criminal charges for perjury to make false accusations against someone he barely knows? The question was devastating because Franklin couldn't explain Tyler's financial motivations without information that Chen hadn't been able to develop through investigation. From the jury's perspective, Franklin was asking them to believe that Tyler had committed serious felonies for no apparent reason. I don't know why Tyler Bennett is lying about me, Franklin admitted, his honesty making him appear evasive rather than credible. The defense case continued with character witnesses who testified about Franklin's integrity and community service, but their impact was limited by Judge Spencer's restrictions on the scope of their testimony. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson described Franklin's honesty and fair dealing, while Danny Martinez praised his willingness to help customers facing financial difficulties. Franklin White is one of the most decent men I've ever known, Mrs. Jackson testified, her elderly voice carrying moral authority that briefly shifted the courtroom's emotional dynamic. In 10 years of doing business with him, he's never been anything but respectful and honest. But Richard's cross-examination of the character witnesses emphasized that they had not witnessed the specific incident involving Derek Stone and therefore couldn't contradict Tyler's eyewitness testimony about Franklin's alleged criminal behavior. Mrs. Jackson, you weren't present at Mr. White's shop on September 15th, were you? Richards asked. No, I wasn't there that day, Mrs. Jackson admitted reluctantly. So you have no personal knowledge of what Mr. White may have said or done to Staff Sergeant Stone? No, but I know Franklin's character and he would never— Thank you, Mrs. Jackson, that's all. The truncated testimony left the jury with an impression that Franklin's supporters were well-meaning but ignorant of his true nature, which had been revealed through Tyler's eyewitness account of criminal behavior. Chen's closing argument attempted to create reasonable doubt about Tyler's testimony while emphasizing the absence of victim testimony and physical evidence. But her presentation lacked the emotional resonance that might have swayed undecided jurors. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to convict Franklin White based entirely on the word of one witness whose testimony is uncorroborated by any physical evidence or victim statement, Chen argued, her voice gaining strength as she approached her conclusion. Staff Sergeant Derek Stone has never claimed that he was threatened or intimidated. The only person saying that criminal behavior occurred is Tyler Bennett. Chen's point about the lack of victim testimony was legally sound but emotionally weak, especially since Richards had already explained Derek's military deployment as the reason for his absence. The jury was more likely to view Derek's unavailability as unfortunate rather than evidence that no crime had occurred. The prosecution has asked you to believe that Franklin White, a man with no criminal record who has operated an honest business for 15 years, suddenly decided to threaten and intimidate a young Marine for no apparent reason, Chen continued. That makes no sense, and it's not supported by the evidence. But Chen's argument was undermined by her inability to explain Tyler's motivations for fabricating criminal charges or to present alternative theories about what had actually happened during Franklin's interaction with Derek Stone. Richards' closing argument was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that transformed Tyler's lies into compelling evidence while portraying Franklin's denials as proof of his deception and dangerousness. Ladies and gentlemen, Tyler Bennett didn't ask to become involved in this case, Richards began, her voice carrying the moral certainty that had made her a successful prosecutor. He was simply walking home from work when he witnessed something that shocked and disturbed him, a young Marine being terrorized by someone who should have been helping him. Richard's description of Tyler as a reluctant hero was particularly effective because it made his testimony appear more credible while suggesting that anyone who doubted his account was unfairly attacking an innocent citizen who had done his civic duty. Franklin White wants you to believe that Tyler Bennett committed serious felonies by lying under oath about witnessing criminal behavior, Richards continued. But ask yourselves, why would Tyler Bennett risk his own freedom to make false accusations against someone he barely knows? What possible motivation could he have for fabricating such specific and detailed testimony? The rhetorical questions were devastating because the jury had no information about Tyler's financial motivations or his history of filing false reports. From their perspective, Tyler appeared to be an ordinary citizen with no reason to lie, while Franklin appeared to be desperately denying obvious evidence of his guilt. The defendant has military training that taught him how to use force and intimidation to achieve his objectives, Richard said, returning to the theme that had run throughout her case. When Derek Stone needed help, Franklin White saw an opportunity to demonstrate his power over someone he viewed as vulnerable and defensible. The characterization of Franklin's military service as training for criminal behavior was perhaps the most cynical aspect of Richards's closing, but it resonated with jurors who had been conditioned by media coverage to view veterans as potentially dangerous rather than inherently honorable. Your verdict in this case will send a message about whether Highland Park County tolerates veterans who use their military backgrounds to threaten and intimidate innocent people, Richards concluded. I trust that you will find Franklin White guilty of all charges and demonstrate that no one is above the law, regardless of their past service to our country. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes before returning with their verdict. Franklin stood beside Lisa Chen as Judge Spencer prepared to read the decision that would determine whether he would walk free or spend the next several years in prison for crimes he had never committed. On the charge of criminal threatening, in the second degree, how do you find? "Guilty," announced the jury foreman, a 51-year-old insurance adjuster whose voice carried no emotion as he destroyed Franklin's life with a single word. "On the charge of intimidation of a witness, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of disorderly conduct, how do you find?" "Guilty." Franklin felt his knees weaken as the third guilty verdict sealed his fate. But he maintained his military bearing even as his world collapsed around him. Behind him, his daughter Vanessa sobbed quietly, while Tyler Bennett smiled with satisfaction at achieving his goal of destroying Franklin's reputation while positioning himself for a lucrative civil settlement. Judge Spencer scheduled sentencing for the following week, allowing time for pre-sentence investigation and victim impact statements. As Franklin was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, the assembled media representatives captured images that would dominate local news coverage, portraying him as a dangerous criminal whose conviction protected the community from veteran violence. The evening news coverage celebrated Tyler Bennett as a courageous citizen whose testimony had ensured justice for Derek Stone, while Franklin was described as a predator whose military training had made him a threat to civilian safety. Channel 8's legal analyst praised Richard's prosecution as an example of how the justice system could protect innocent victims from dangerous veterans who exploited their backgrounds for criminal purposes. In Highland Park County Jail, Franklin sat in his cell, contemplating the reality that 12 strangers had chosen to believe Tyler Bennett's lies, rather than his truthful account of helping Derek Stone. The simple act of fixing a motorcycle for free had somehow resulted in criminal convictions that would follow him for the rest of his life, destroying his reputation and possibly his freedom. But what Franklin didn't know was that thousands of miles away, Derek Stone had finally received permission to contact American authorities about the false charges filed against the man who had helped him. Military communication protocols were being expedited, and within hours, Pentagon officials would be reviewing Derek's urgent requests to testify on behalf of Franklin White. The nightmare that had consumed Franklin's life for months was about to encounter the one force powerful enough to expose Tyler's lies and vindicate an innocent man: the truth, backed by the full authority of the United States military and delivered by the very person Tyler claimed to have been protecting. Colonel James Palmer sat in his Pentagon office at 6:30 hours on the morning of Franklin White's scheduled sentencing, reviewing an urgent communication that had arrived through classified military channels during the night. The message, originating from Staff Sergeant Derek Stone's deployment location, contained information that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of a civilian criminal case that had captured national attention. "General Tucker needs to see this immediately," Palmer told his aide, Major Scott Rodriguez, as he forwarded Derek's detailed statement about the false charges filed against Franklin White. "We have a decorated combat veteran about to be sentenced for crimes that never occurred, and the only witness who can exonerate him has been trapped in communication blackout for months." General William Tucker had just finished his morning briefing when Palmer's urgent message reached his secure terminal. As a four-star general responsible for Army personnel affairs, Tucker received hundreds of communications daily, but Derek Stone's desperate plea for help with a civilian legal matter demanded immediate attention due to its implications for military-civilian relations and veteran welfare. "Colonel Palmer, get me everything we have on this Franklin White case," General Tucker ordered over his secure phone line. "If one of our Marines is being prevented from testifying on behalf of someone who helped him, we need to understand why civilian authorities didn't contact us through proper channels." Palmer's investigation revealed a systemic failure in communication between Highland Park County law enforcement and military authorities. Detective Maria Powell had made no attempt to contact Derek Stone through official military channels, instead relying entirely on Tyler Bennett's uncorroborated accusations to build her case against Franklin. More disturbing was Palmer's discovery that Franklin White himself was a decorated Army veteran whose service record had been sealed in classified files due to his involvement in sensitive operations during the Afghanistan conflict. The Pentagon's personnel database showed that Franklin had been recommended for the Silver Star after a classified mission in which his actions had saved 43 American lives, but the recommendation had been lost in bureaucratic transfers. Following his commanding officer's death, "General, we have a problem," Palmer reported during his emergency briefing with Tucker. "Franklin White isn't just an innocent civilian being railroaded by false accusations. He's one of our own, a combat engineer whose heroic actions were never properly recognized due to administrative failures." General Tucker's expression hardened as he reviewed Franklin's classified service record, which detailed extraordinary courage under fire that had earned him the respect of every soldier who served with him. The idea that such a man was facing prison time based on fabricated accusations was personally offensive to Tucker, who had built his career on ensuring that military personnel received the recognition and protection they deserved. "Colonel, prepare my helicopter," Tucker ordered. "We're going to Highland Park, Indiana, and we're bringing Franklin White's complete service record with us. This travesty ends today." Meanwhile, in Highland Park County Courthouse, Franklin sat in the defendant's holding cell wearing the same borrowed suit he had worn throughout his trial. The sentencing hearing was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and District Attorney Richards had already announced her intention to seek the maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment to send a strong message about veteran accountability. Lisa Chen visited Franklin one final time before sentencing, her face showing the defeat of a public defender who had been overwhelmed by a case beyond her experience and resources. "Franklin, I want you to know that I believe you're innocent," Chen said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "But the jury has spoken, and Judge Spencer is under political pressure to impose a harsh sentence. I'm going to argue for probation, but you should prepare yourself for prison time." Franklin nodded with the stoic acceptance that had carried him through months of injustice, though his heart broke at the thought of his daughter Vanessa watching him sentenced to years behind bars for crimes that existed only in Tyler Bennett's imagination. "Ms. Chen, I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for me," Franklin replied with characteristic dignity. "You fought as hard as anyone could with the resources you had available." The courtroom began filling with spectators who had followed Franklin's case through months of media coverage, while news cameras positioned outside prepared to capture his sentencing for evening broadcasts. Tyler Bennett arrived early to secure a front row seat, anticipating the satisfaction of watching Franklin receive the prison sentence that would validate his fabricated testimony. District Attorney Richards entered the courthouse, confident that Franklin's sentencing would provide the perfect capstone to her mayoral campaign, demonstrating her effectiveness as a prosecutor who held dangerous veterans accountable for criminal behavior. Her prepared statement emphasized community safety and the importance of protecting innocent victims from predatory individuals who exploited their military backgrounds. At exactly 0847 hours, the distinctive sound of military helicopter rotors began echoing across downtown Highland Park as General Tucker's aircraft approached the courthouse. The UH-60 Black Hawk's arrival sent ripples of confusion through the assembled crowd, as no one could understand why military aircraft would be involved in a civilian criminal sentencing. General Tucker emerged from the helicopter wearing his dress uniform with 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, accompanied by Colonel Palmer and 2 armed military police officers. The general carried a locked briefcase containing Franklin's classified service records and Derek Stone's sworn statement about the true nature of his interaction with Franklin White. "I am General William Tucker, United States Army," the general announced to the crowd of reporters and spectators gathered outside the courthouse. "I am here on behalf of Staff Sergeant Derek Stone, who has been prevented from testifying in defense of a fellow veteran who is about to be unjustly sentenced for crimes that never occurred." The general's presence immediately transformed the media narrative surrounding Franklin's case, as reporters realized they were witnessing an unprecedented military intervention in civilian legal proceedings. News directors across the region began breaking into regular programming to cover the developing story. Inside the courthouse, Judge Spencer was preparing to call Franklin's sentencing hearing to order when his bailiff informed him of General Tucker's arrival and request for an emergency hearing to present new evidence in the Franklin White case. "Your Honor, General Tucker is requesting immediate access to present testimony from Staff Sergeant Derek Stone, who was allegedly the victim in this case," Bailiff Tom Murphy explained nervously. Judge Spencer found himself in an impossible position, caught between his planned sentencing of Franklin and the arrival of the Army's highest-ranking officer, with evidence that might overturn the conviction. Political calculation warred with judicial responsibility as Spencer realized that refusing to hear military testimony might create a scandal that would destroy his own career. "Bring General Tucker to my chambers immediately," Judge Spencer ordered, recognizing that his handling of this situation would determine his future on the bench. The meeting in Judge Spencer's chambers lasted exactly 12 minutes, during which General Tucker presented Derek Stone's sworn statement and demanded an immediate hearing to present evidence that Franklin White was not only innocent of all charges, but was actually a decorated war hero whose service had been improperly classified for 15 years. "Your Honor, Staff Sergeant Derek Stone has provided a detailed account of his interaction with Franklin White that completely contradicts the testimony used to convict him," General Tucker said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Moreover, Mr. White's military service record shows that he is one of the most decorated veterans in recent Army history, a man whose courage saved 43 American lives during classified operations in Afghanistan. Judge Spencer reviewed Derek's statement with growing alarm as he realized that Tyler Bennett's testimony had been completely fabricated. Derek described Franklin as helpful and generous, refusing payment for motorcycle repairs and sending him safely on his way to Camp Lejeune. There had been no threats, no intimidation, no criminal behavior of any kind. "General Tucker, why wasn't this information available during Mr. White's trial?" Judge Spencer asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because Highland Park County law enforcement made no attempt to contact Staff Sergeant Stone through proper military channels," Tucker replied coldly. "They built their entire case on the word of a civilian witness without ever speaking to the alleged victim. The revelation that Franklin's prosecution had proceeded without victim testimony or proper investigation created a legal and political crisis that Judge Spencer was completely unprepared to handle. Overturning Franklin's conviction would require admitting that Highland Park County's justice system had failed catastrophically, but allowing the sentencing to proceed would mean imprisoning a war hero based on lies. General, I need to reconvene court immediately to address this new evidence, Judge Spencer said, recognizing that his career depended on handling this situation correctly. The courtroom erupted in confusion when Judge Spencer announced that sentencing would be delayed pending presentation of new evidence from military authorities. District Attorney Richards objected vehemently to any post-conviction proceedings, but her protests were overwhelmed by the presence of General Tucker and the implications of Derek Stone's testimony. Your Honor, the prosecution objects to any attempt to relitigate this case after the jury has rendered its verdict, Richards argued desperately. Mr. White has been convicted by a jury of his peers based on credible eyewitness testimony. Ms. "Richards, the eyewitness testimony appears to have been fabricated," Judge Spencer replied, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "The alleged victim in this case has provided a statement that completely contradicts the prosecution's theory of events." General Tucker took the witness stand with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect throughout a distinguished military career. His testimony would not only exonerate Franklin, but also expose the systematic failures that had allowed an innocent man to be convicted based on lies. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to present testimony from Staff Sergeant Derek Stone, who was prevented from defending Franklin White due to military deployment and communication restrictions," General Tucker began. "Sergeant Stone has provided a sworn statement describing his interaction with Mr. White, and that statement proves beyond any doubt that no criminal behavior occurred." Tucker read Derek's detailed account of Franklin's kindness and professionalism, describing how the mechanic had diagnosed his motorcycle problem, provided a free repair, and sent him safely on his way to Camp Lejeune. Derek's statement specifically contradicted every element of Tyler Bennett's fabricated testimony. Furthermore, General Tucker continued, "Franklin White is not simply an innocent civilian who has been wrongly convicted. He is a decorated Army combat engineer whose classified service record shows extraordinary heroism under fire that saved the lives of 43 American soldiers during sensitive operations in Afghanistan. The revelation that Franklin was actually a war hero whose service had been kept classified sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Tyler Bennett's face went pale as he realized that his fabricated accusations had targeted someone whose military record would make him a sympathetic figure to any jury. Mr. White was recommended for the Silver Star for his actions during a classified mission in which he defused multiple improvised explosive devices under enemy fire, allowing the evacuation of wounded soldiers who would otherwise have died, Tucker testified. That recommendation was lost due to administrative failures following his commanding officer's death, but the Pentagon has now declassified his service record to ensure that his heroism receives proper recognition. General Tucker presented Franklin's declassified Silver Star citation to the court, along with commendations from every officer who had served with him during his 4 deployments to Afghanistan. The documents painted a picture of extraordinary courage and dedication that was completely incompatible with Tyler Bennett's characterization of Franklin as a dangerous predator. District Attorney Richards realized that her political career was disintegrating as General Tucker's testimony exposed the prosecution's case as a house of cards built on false accusations and inadequate investigation. The media narrative that had portrayed her as a defender of veteran victims was collapsing as the truth emerged about Franklin's actual character and service record. "Your Honor," Richard said desperately, "the military's testimony, while compelling, cannot override a jury verdict based on eyewitness evidence." "Ms. Richards," Judge Spencer replied coldly, "the eyewitness evidence appears to have been perjured testimony, and the alleged victim has now provided a statement that completely exonerates the defendant." Tyler Bennett sat in the courtroom gallery, watching his carefully constructed lies being systematically destroyed by military testimony that he had never anticipated. His personal injury lawsuit against Highland Park County would collapse along with Franklin's conviction, and he now faced potential federal charges for perjury and filing false reports. As General Tucker concluded his testimony, Franklin sat at the defense table feeling overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of his fortunes. The man whose conviction had seemed inevitable just hours earlier was about to be vindicated by military intervention that exposed the truth about both Tyler's lies and his own heroic service record. The stage was set for a dramatic conclusion. that would not only free Franklin, but also transform him from convicted criminal to honored veteran, while exposing the systematic failures that had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life through prosecutorial ambition and racial prejudice. Judge Spencer's gavel struck the wooden block with finality as he announced his decision to vacate all charges against Franklin White, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who understood he was correcting one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in Highland Park County's history. The packed courtroom erupted in chaos as spectators processed the dramatic reversal that had transformed Franklin from convicted criminal to exonerated war hero in the span of 2 hours. After reviewing the sworn testimony of Staff Sergeant Derrick Stone and the declassified military service records presented by General Tucker, this court finds that the charges against Franklin White were based on fabricated evidence and prosecutorial misconduct, Judge Spencer declared, his words carrying across a courtroom where absolute silence had replaced the earlier chaos. All convictions are hereby vacated, and Mr. White is ordered released immediately with a full apology from this court. Franklin sat at the defense table feeling overwhelmed by emotions he had suppressed during months of wrongful imprisonment and character assassination. The simple words, "released immediately," seemed impossible after so many months of believing that truth and justice were insufficient protection against a system determined to destroy him. Furthermore, Judge Spencer continued, his voice growing stronger as he addressed the broader implications of Franklin's case, "I am ordering a complete investigation into the Highland Park County District Attorney's Office and Police Department to determine how an innocent man came so close to being imprisoned based on perjured testimony and inadequate investigation." District Attorney Amanda Richards watched her political career disintegrate as Judge Spencer essentially accused her office of prosecutorial misconduct that had nearly resulted in the wrongful imprisonment of a decorated war hero. The media representatives present would ensure that her reputation as a prosecutor who valued political advancement over justice would follow her for the rest of her career. Tyler Bennett attempted to slip out of the courtroom unnoticed, but Federal Marshal Jennifer Brooks was waiting for him at the back door with handcuffs and federal warrants charging him with perjury, filing false reports, and conspiracy to defraud Highland Park County through his fabricated civil lawsuit. "Tyler Bennett, you're under arrest for federal crimes related to false testimony in this case," Marshal Brooks announced as she placed him in custody. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right." Tyler's arrest provided a satisfying conclusion to months of watching him profit from lies that had destroyed Franklin's reputation and livelihood. The young man, who had fabricated criminal charges for financial gain, would now face the reality of federal prosecution and potential prison time that would far exceed anything Franklin had faced. General Tucker approached Franklin as he was released from custody, extending his hand to a fellow veteran whose service had finally received the recognition it deserved. The meeting between the four-star general and the humble mechanic symbolized the military's commitment to protecting its own, regardless of rank or circumstances. "Sergeant White, it is my honor to meet you," General Tucker said, using Franklin's former military rank as a sign of respect. "Your service to this country has been exemplary, and the Army owes you a debt that can never fully be repaid." Franklin felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized that his military service, which had been twisted into evidence against him during his trial, was now being honored by the highest levels of Army leadership. The Silver Star that should have been awarded 15 years earlier would finally be presented, along with formal recognition of his heroic actions in Afghanistan. "General Tucker, I just did my job like any soldier would," Franklin replied with the modesty that had characterized his entire life. "But I want to thank you for believing in the truth when nobody else would." Sergeant White, the truth about your service and character should never have been hidden, Tucker responded. The Army is going to ensure that your story reaches every American who needs to understand what real heroism looks like. The courthouse steps became the site of an impromptu celebration as Franklin's supporters, who had maintained faith in his innocence throughout the ordeal, gathered to welcome him back to freedom. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, despite her age and mobility issues, was among the first to reach Franklin as he emerged from the building that had nearly destroyed his life. "Franklin White, I never doubted you for a minute," Mrs. Jackson said, embracing him with the fierce loyalty of someone who had known his true character when others chose to believe lies. "This community owes you an apology, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Reverend Margaret Foster led an impromptu prayer of thanksgiving on the courthouse steps, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd as she thanked God for revealing truth and protecting the innocent. The prayer provided a moment of reflection for community members who were beginning to understand how close they had come to destroying one of Highland Park's most honorable residents. "Lord, we thank you for bringing justice to Franklin White and for showing us the danger of judging others without understanding their true character." Reverend Foster prayed, her words serving as both gratitude and gentle rebuke to those who had condemned Franklin based on assumptions and prejudice. Emma Stone, Derek's sister and the investigative journalist who had worked tirelessly to expose the truth about Franklin's case, approached him with genuine respect for his dignity throughout the ordeal. "Mr. White, I want to apologize on behalf of my brother, who feels terrible that his deployment prevented him from testifying sooner," Emma said, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who understood how close Franklin had come to wrongful imprisonment. "Derek asked me to tell you that your kindness saved his career, and he will never forget what you did for him." Franklin's reunion with his daughter Vanessa was perhaps the most emotional moment of a day filled with overwhelming experiences. Vanessa had spent months watching her father's reputation destroyed while maintaining absolute faith in his innocence, and seeing him vindicated felt like witnessing a miracle. "Dad, I'm so proud of you for never giving up," Vanessa said, holding her father close as news cameras captured their reunion. "You showed everyone what real courage looks like, even when the whole system was against you." "Sweetheart, I couldn't have survived this without knowing you believed in me," Franklin replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Your faith gave me strength when I didn't think I had any left." The media coverage of Franklin's exoneration was as intense as the coverage of his original arrest, but the narrative had completely reversed. Channel 8, which had promoted the dangerous veteran story throughout Franklin's prosecution, now featured segments about heroic veterans who deserved recognition and protection rather than persecution. Today, we witnessed an extraordinary example of military brotherhood and the power of truth to overcome injustice, announced Jessica Anderson during Channel 8's evening newscast. Franklin White's story reminds us that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that we must be more careful about rushing to judgment based on incomplete information. The reversal in media coverage highlighted how easily public opinion could be manipulated by skilled prosecutors and false witnesses, while also demonstrating the press's responsibility to investigate rather than simply repeat official narratives. Highland Park County faced immediate pressure to reform its criminal justice procedures to prevent future wrongful prosecutions. The county commissioners announced a comprehensive review of police investigation standards and prosecutorial practices, while promising financial compensation for Franklin's wrongful imprisonment and business losses. Highland Park County deeply regrets the injustice suffered by Franklin White and commits to implementing reforms that will prevent similar tragedies in the future. announced County Commissioner Robert Hayes, whose previous support for Franklin's prosecution now seemed politically toxic. Attorney Jason Hartwell, who had encouraged Tyler Bennett's false accusations as part of a civil lawsuit strategy, found himself facing professional sanctions and potential criminal charges for his role in the fraudulent scheme. His law license was suspended pending investigation, and his practice faced bankruptcy as other questionable cases came under scrutiny. The most satisfying development for Franklin was the reopening of White's Automotive, which quickly became busier than ever as community members sought to demonstrate their support through patronage. The closed indefinitely sign was replaced with a banner reading, "Welcome Home Franklin, Highland Park's Hero," donated by local veterans organizations. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson was among the first customers to return, bringing her ancient Buick for routine maintenance while expressing her unwavering loyalty to the man who had been vindicated against all odds. "Franklin, I need you to check my brakes again," Mrs. Jackson said with a smile that conveyed both affection and determination to support his business. "And don't you dare try to give me any discount. You've earned every penny of what you charge." The simple return to routine automotive work felt like a blessing to Franklin, who had feared he might never again experience the satisfaction of solving mechanical problems and helping community members with their transportation needs. Each customer who returned represented a small victory over the forces that had tried to destroy his livelihood. Danny Martinez brought his pickup truck for an oil change, but more importantly, he brought an apology from the construction workers, who had initially believed the false accusations against Franklin. "Mr. White, the guys at work want you to know we're sorry we doubted you," Danny said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "We should have known better than to believe Tyler Bennett over someone who had always treated us right." Franklin's response reflected the grace and forgiveness that had sustained him throughout his ordeal. Danny. People believed what they were, told by officials they trusted. "I don't hold that against anyone who was trying to do the right thing." The reconciliation with community members who had initially believed Tyler's lies represented a healing process that would take time, but promised to strengthen Highland Park's social fabric. Franklin's willingness to forgive those who had doubted him demonstrated the character that had made him a respected community member long before his military heroism was revealed. 6 months after his exoneration, Franklin stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Williams presented him with the Silver Star that should have been awarded 15 years earlier. The ceremony was attended by every soldier who had served with Franklin in Afghanistan and could travel to Washington, creating a reunion that honored both individual heroism and collective sacrifice. Sergeant Franklin White represents the best of American military service and civilian character, President Williams said as he pinned the Silver Star to Franklin's jacket. His courage under fire saved dozens of American lives, and his dignity under persecution inspired a nation to examine its commitment to justice and truth. The White House ceremony was broadcast live across the nation, ensuring that Franklin's story of heroism and vindication reached millions of Americans who needed to understand that heroes often live quietly among us, serving their communities. Without seeking recognition or reward, Derek Stone, finally returned from deployment, stood in the front row of White House guests, his presence completing the circle of justice that had begun with a broken motorcycle on Highway 67. His relief at seeing Franklin honored rather than imprisoned was evident in his emotional response to the ceremony. "Mr. White saved my career when he fixed my motorcycle, but he saved my faith in justice when he maintained his dignity throughout this ordeal," Derek said during the reception following the ceremony. He's the kind of man every service member hopes to become. Franklin's story became a teaching case in law schools across the country, illustrating the dangers of prosecutorial ambition, racial bias, and inadequate investigation. His example also inspired reforms in military-civilian communication protocols to ensure that deployed service members could testify in legal proceedings that affected fellow veterans. Highland Park eventually erected a memorial honoring Franklin's service and character, with a plaque reading, "In honor of Franklin White, whose courage in war and dignity in peace remind us that true heroes serve others without seeking recognition." The memorial stood outside the courthouse where he had nearly been wrongfully sentenced, serving as a permanent reminder of the importance of seeking truth over convenient narratives. As Franklin returned to his daily routine of fixing cars and helping neighbors, he carried with him the knowledge that one person's commitment to truth and justice could overcome the most powerful forces of prejudice and corruption. His simple act of helping Derek Stone had ultimately led to his own vindication and the exposure of systemic failures that threatened other innocent people. The mechanic who had been arrested for helping a stranded Marine had become a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of truth to triumph over lies, proving that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people among us are carrying the most extraordinary secrets of courage and character. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.